let us know if you have any issues with that. You can write in the chat. So just some rules for the day. Please mute your microphones at all time when you're not speaking. If possible, can you please put your videos on when speaking so that we can see your fantastic faces? It just makes it a little bit more engaging. We're not going to have any time allocated for questions after the sessions, but please put your questions in the chat, and we've got people checking the chat at all times, and hopefully we'll be able to either respond live, or the speakers can check the chat after their presentations and respond to any questions that are there. We're quite happy for, you know, a side event to continue in the chat, and do feel free to engage in that. So most importantly, please do introduce yourself. You know, a lot of us do know each other, but it's really nice to have a bit more of a formal introduction from everybody before you start speaking. And equally in the chat, if you can do that as well, that's useful. If you are having technical difficulties, please send a private message to Step Hazelden in the chat, and he will try and help if he can. We're not technological wizards, so it might just be a case of switching your device off and coming back in again, but we will help as best we can. Next slide, Tom. Okay, so the agenda for today, I will stop speaking soon, and we'll be handing over to the Shelter and Home-Based Enterprise team. We will have a break at 2 o'clock. We seem to have gone backwards. That's fine. We'll have a break at 2 o'clock for 20 minutes. Please try and be on time, because we've got a very tight packed schedule today, which will make it exciting, but we just need to be very punctual. We have then 2 further sessions of presentations with a break in the middle at 3:30 for 15 minutes. And then at the end of the sessions, in the afternoon, we hope that you can join us for a post-event Zoom room crawl with drinks and chats, and we have separate locations for that. So I think we would be really pleased to see you there to debrief afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Victoria, Elizabeth, Beth and Fiona to present on home-based enterprises and shelter. Please take it away.
Hi Amelia, hi everyone. Thank you very much for inviting us to present. We have you for an hour, which is almost an hour, which is really great. Next slide, please. In this session, we're hoping to give some presentations to give you an introduction to our topic. Then we're hoping to split into focus groups and then come back and summarise the key issues. I'm going to start with an introduction to the topic. Next. And next again. So I wanted to start by talking about these 2 diagrams, which we're all really familiar with. The one on the left comes from the latest edition of the Sphere Standard, so from 2018, and the one on the right comes from Shelter Projects Essentials, which has just been published. And I wanted to highlight what they say about shelter and livelihoods. So I'm not sure if there's a next slide that has red lines on it. Yes. So the one on the left, the Sphere Standard, says shelters must be, quote, located to provide access to livelihood opportunities, end quote, which should be close to the shelter. On the right, Shelter Projects Essentials says, my shelter is near my work. So I wanted to start with a question. Does work always take place outside the home? Next. If this is how we think about shelter, then as built environment professionals, we're trained to think about things like the location of the shelter within the settlement, the location of employment opportunities, and the availability and affordability of transport between the two. A lot of us have experienced our homes and cities differently over the past year due to COVID, but I'm sure this is what many of us will return to as soon as our offices open. Don't get me wrong, location, employment, and transport are important, and there are many shelter programs which don't get them right. But this is not what work looks like in most of the places where we provide humanitarian shelter. Next. As we all know, the future of humanitarian response is urban. More specifically, the future of humanitarian response is informal settlements in urban areas in the Global South. In these contexts, 20 to 50% of households run small home-based enterprises, known as HBEs, from within or around their home. Also, it's estimated that HBEs generate 50 to 75% of household incomes. So rather than a neat separation between home and workplace in the places where we work, people are much more likely to live like the families in these drawings, making and selling products from within and around their homes. Next. Home-based enterprises can take many forms, so people need to adapt their homes in many different ways. Home-based enterprises can be as simple as a table or a chair from which to cook, sew, or provide haircuts. They range from the use of a room or window to make or sell goods and services, through kiosks and extensions, to the use of a whole floor of a home for a shop, cafe, or factory. Maybe you've seen things like this and thought they weren't very important, so you just ignored them. Maybe you half saw them because you were busy implementing a shelter program. You may even have worked on projects where people were not allowed to use their homes like this. But this is a really important topic because if we ignore home-based enterprises, then we're ignoring women. Most HBEs are run by women, and at least 50% more women work in households with HBEs than those without. Next. Oh, sorry, next again. We're also missing a massive opportunity to help people restart their livelihoods. In 2005, Shepherd and Hill argued that HBEs are the single most important income source for the populations most affected by disaster. And the contribution of shelter to HBEs is the most important way that shelter can support economic development in post-disaster societies. Next.
Yeah, hopefully you can all hear me. Great, I've got some approving nods. Yeah, so hi everyone. So I've been working with Victoria, Elizabeth and Fiona on this topic, and we've decided, because this is such an important topic to the communities that we work with, and particularly for women, we would start to kind of do a bit of a global scoping study to see how much information there is out there about HBEs and what they might be called. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide. Thank you. So we started with a couple of research questions. So thinking about, because these two topics go hand in hand, the home-based enterprise and the shelter, what are the impacts or the effects of shelter on home-based enterprises? And conversely, what are the effects of home-based enterprises or HBEs on shelter? So these were the original research questions, which we started with, but we ran into quite a few challenges with this. So using the search term shelter, there's almost no humanitarian evidence, and pretty much everything is related to housing and not shelter. And with the term HBE, whilst this is used by quite a few people, depending on the discipline that people come from, whether it's architecture, planning, geography, gender studies, economics, they all use different terms to describe these types of business. So the things like home-based work, home-based employment. There's absolutely no mention of home-based livelihood, which you think might be a kind of obvious one, but that's not there. And this was a big challenge with the global scoping study, and Elizabeth will also mention this a bit later. So because of this, we had to slightly change the kind of framing of the research questions. So next slide, please. So to look at what are the effects of housing on home-based work and what are the effects of home-based work on housing, because these are the most common terms used to describe this type of livelihood within the literature. So an example of the effect of housing on home-based work, if you've got your business at home and you have poor infrastructure or poor lighting, for example, it impacts how well you might be able to conduct your work activities. So just an example there from India. And conversely, whilst home-based work can have a really positive impact on, for example, shelter upgrading, it can also be a negative impact. So you don't have the division between the home and the workspace, which is probably something we're all quite familiar with at the moment in times of COVID. So next slide, please. So with these new research questions, we've been running this method for the last couple of months. So we've searched a number of different sources, so academic databases in both Spanish and English. We've searched grey literature, so looking at things like evaluation reports, case studies from the shelter sector and in development literature. We've looked at a few books and we ran a social media consultation to see if anyone had any particular papers that they wanted to recommend. That's, oh, what's happened there? Can anyone else not see the slide? Just me?
No, I don't see
back to the presentation.
That's all right. No
Apologies, I'm having some issues with my screens. I will get it back to the right place as quick as possible.
That's all right, no worries. I could do a little dance,
Yeah,
play some elevator music. I think it's 146. Yeah, right. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so we ran a social media consultation, but if anyone has got any particular studies that they know on this topic, feel free to pop them in the chat and we can kind of add them to our list. So doing this search, and we were only looking at papers since and publications since the year 2000, we found just over 1,700 mentions of homes and home-based work, or housing and home-based work. And then we've done a bit of screening, so removing duplicates, looking for keywords, and then screening for relevance, so removing things that are specifically on, for example, workers' rights, and they don't mention shelter or housing or how the space is used. And that's got us down to 46 documents, which I think we can probably all agree is not very many. So next slide, please. And just a kind of brief summary of what we've found so far, there are kind of some real key themes emerging. So lots of the locations, there tend to be clusters of studies in Southeast Asia, particularly Bangladesh and India, Western Africa, so particularly Ghana. And there's these 4 multi-country comparison studies looking at home-based work. And all of these studies are kind of dominantly from the same groups of people. So there were kind of fairly large research projects funded in the kind of early 2000s on this topic. They're almost all in development settings, so kind of all but one is in a development setting. Humanitarian studies that we found are mostly rural, mostly about recovery after the Indian Ocean tsunami, and were largely excluded just because they didn't have enough information to help us answer the research questions. And something that's not on this slide, which I should mention, is almost all of the studies mention gender in some way, talking about the importance of home-based work for women in the global south. But we determined through this scoping study that there are large gaps in Latin America and the Caribbean and in the humanitarian sector in understanding this topic. So Elizabeth is now going to talk a little bit through some of the findings from LAC.
Well, thank you, Beth and Victoria. My name is Elizabeth Wagemann, and I'm an architect, and I have been working on doing some research on post-disaster housing and shelter after disasters in Latin America since 2010. So we have been working on this topic that for me is new because I've done research on housing modifications and shelter modifications, but not specifically in home-based work. Next, please. So when we started doing the research to see what happened in LAC, one of the difficulties that we had was to find the right words in English, because it's very important to define the same concept, that we understand the same concepts. And because we come from different disciplines or from different backgrounds, the way we say things have an impact in our results. And so we found home-based enterprise and home-based business, and we realized that it was very related to how the economy works there, but also we found home-based work that we felt that it was more a broader concept for us that can relate to some type of work that maybe is not an enterprise, for example. Also, we found home-based economic activities or home-based income generation. So for us, it was very important to scan through all these keywords to find the right concept and that we feel and understand the same ideas. Next, please. So if in English was difficult because they had different meanings, in Spanish was even harder. So because we call not only home-based, and you can see there in English that we have the same home base, you know, like as a core, but in Spanish we have doméstico, which means domestic, casa, which is house, vivienda means housing, and hogar, which means home. So it was very difficult to find the right terms. For example, we have this trabajo doméstico, which means domestic work, which we realized that a lot of the documents there were related to nanny or people working for someone else in their houses. Also, to have trabajo en casa, which means work in home or work from home, were very different, because work from home, it was very related to teleworking, for example, but work in the house, it was doing some work, the home-based work in the or around the house. Also, we found different other words like vivienda negocio, which means house business or house workshop, family business. And also the last one that says casa vivienda productiva, what's very interesting is productive house or productive housing, because it has the balance between producing something and the house, which is the space that we want to analyze. Next, please. We are still in process. We are doing, we are scanning through the documents, but a very early comparison between the abstracts and titles from the documents, we realized there were some words that appear repeatedly, and you can see there in this map that we have home, space, and woman and self-employment as the main topics. Of course, home was, because they're a home-based something, is the main topic, but also, as Victoria and Beth mentioned, women and gender appeared as a very important topic. And we, at the beginning, we didn't start with that, but we really realized through the process that that was a very important issue in this topic, because many women, they don't have other alternative than to work from home. Next, please. So now what we're doing is we're trying to make a proposal to have some empirical, not only the scoping or literature review, but to have some empirical information. We made, we're looking for funding for this proposal, relations between domestic space and workspace. And we have a case study in Chile after the 2015 mudslide and floods in Atacama. And we found that this example, these cases were very interesting, because we could compare the same typology of house being used for 150 in one settlement and 250 in another settlement. So we can make a comparison between the changes and adaptations they have done to the same typology of house in different houses. Next, please. So you can see these are adaptations after only 1 year after the disaster. Next, please. And how even big brands come to these settlements to provide home-based business or home-based work or home-based enterprises, as we have been studying. Next, please. So some work related to this that we have from my PhD is this understanding that shelter is a process, that we know that there are housing trajectories, and here on the left you can see how that process happened during the years. And even though the example that you're seeing there is the use of a tea shelter as a fishing workshop, storage gear, equipment, this research was not focused on HP work. So now we are moving to trying to find work related to analyze these trajectories, but also based on home-based work. So if you want to see more information about this type of project, we have there our my ResearchGate profile, where you can see the PhD that comes from that resulted in this research, and also a project, sorry, a publication on need for adaptation, this transformation of temporary houses. So now Fiona is going to show you what we're doing in this research in humanitarian. Fiona.
Yeah, hi everyone. So as Beth mentioned, the global scoping study showed that what currently exists focuses more on the housing and the development oriented side of things. And there's a gap of understanding and research from humanitarian sources. Next slide. So I was involved in the research that was published and released last year called The Wider Impacts of Shelter and Settlement Assistance, which was a much broader study that looked at the links, the impacts of shelter on many different sectors, one of which was livelihoods. And as I was looking at so many different sectors, I really only searched under the term livelihoods, and the findings that came out broadly focused around either employment opportunities, the contributions to economic development on a macro level, or on poverty reduction. And although the importance of shelter as a place of work, not just as a place to get to work, did come up, there wasn't actually that much that came out that was focused around home-based work in and of itself. Next slide. So the information that was found revolved around the use of the assets that were provided to re-establish or expand home-based income generation activities, either the use of tea shelters as business premises after they've been occupied or in addition, or as a platform for developing new small businesses. And it was said in one of the sources that really we could use the percentage of destroyed dwellings as a proxy itself for the percentage of destroyed livelihoods. The link was so strong between home-based work or home-based income generation and shelter. So building on what Elizabeth was explaining about the terminology, we're now hoping that by expanding search terms within the humanitarian sector as well, we'll be able to gather more information about this important topic. And we're also looking for your inputs and contributions, which is where I'll hand back over to Victoria to introduce the focus group discussions.
Next. Hi again. Yeah, so now we're going to try and split into 4 different focus groups, because this is very much work in progress. So we would like to hear what you think about what we're working on, and whether or not you have any examples, and where you think we should focus our future research. So the first focus group is going to be on how would you describe home-based work, with Elizabeth talking about terminology in different languages. The second one is going to be talking about examples of shelter and home-based work from practice with Beth. The third one is lessons from programs which have supported shelter and home-based work. What has worked well, what has not? And the fourth one is going to be with me talking about what are the most important issues in shelter and home-based work, helping us prioritise future research. So I think that's it. I think now we're allocated to our focus groups.
Thanks, Victoria. There is an option actually for people to choose which focus group they want to go to, or I can assign people randomly. and is 20 minutes about right?
Yes, we're expecting 20 minutes.
And random's easiest, so let's just do that.
Yeah.
Random's quickest.
Okay, and if you particularly don't want to be in a particular group, then come back into the plenary and we will reassign you. Okay, I'm pressing go and we'll see what happens.
Fingers crossed.
Victoria, Fiona, Beth, I'm going to room 1, just in case.
I've got room 4. I don't know if Victoria and Beth have already accepted.
You're all good, I think. I've got it in front of me.
Yeah, you should all be in different rooms.
So everybody in plenary, if you can hear me, can you see a sign to being invited to a breakout room? We're not forcing you into the breakout rooms if you don't want to go, but just double checking that you can see the invite.
Hi, Amelia. I had an invite to room number 1, but I was hoping to get into room number 4. So I don't know how to kind of get into that.
Okay, let me just.
I should be able to do that.
Yeah, Step will do that. He has the power.
Cool.
So you want to go to room 4, Graham?
Yeah, that's possible, please. Yeah, not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens. Here we go.
Cool. Thanks very much.
Nat, did you want to go into a particular room? Or Tim or John?
They're all assigned, Amelia.
Okay.
If there's anyone that joined late, I've given the option to join the room, so they're obviously multitasking.
Yeah, that's fine. It was a subtle nudge.
Yeah, and I can't force them. We can't force them to join.
Well, I can go into room 1.
Okay.
So that seems to have the least. Or if you just want to admit that
Some people are having comms problems.
Okay. Well, maybe just put anyone new into room 1. Oh, I can do it.
Okay.
I seem to have the power as well.
Yeah, you should do. I'll just message Chris.
Quite a lot of people joining late. Hi, Boshra. Hi, Boshra. We're in breakout rooms, so I'm just going to pop you in one to have a chat. We need to make Victoria co-host.
Yeah.
I don't know how you. We might have to. You might have to go into room 1 to do it, Steph.
Okay.
Because I don't know how we find her. Because it's kind of like she's in another meeting now.
Is she not in room 2?
Yeah, she's in room 2.
Why Indonesia, out of interest?
Oh, why did I want to go?
Yeah, because you mentioned going back. I thought, is there?
I've worked on, because I've done work on Indonesia after the tsunami and other things, and I keep going back and working with. Well, I don't keep going back. I've done previous research.
Victoria, I've just come in to try and sort out the screen sharing thing, and I don't have the power to do this in the breakout room. So
Okay.
I don't. Maybe if we both leave the room, I can do it in plenary, and then you can rejoin. We knew something would go wrong with Zoom.
Okay, is it a problem for anyone who's currently in this breakout and contributing?
No, don't mind.
Okay.
I think we might just live with it because actually we're working in it anyway. I don't think we need me to share it.
That's
to be
fine.
honest, I'm not that good at that.
I will leave you to it in that case. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay. Thank you. There might be more in the other groups.
Victoria, I had a question that was just
Yeah.
to try and be.
Did you manage Step?
Hi, Amelia. No, I couldn't do it in the breakout room. There's no option to make co-hosts, but they're quite happy carrying on chatting. So Victoria was quite relaxed.
Okay, it's fine. They had some Google. They wanted to share Google. Yeah, I guess we should have made them a co-host beforehand. But.
Yeah, well, that's our Zoom learning point for today.
Okay. Yeah, that's quite curious because I can always share my screen in the breakout room. In other things.
I think it might be in my global settings that only hosts can do it, and so that would have been the, you either have just hosts or everyone can share their screen.
Yeah.
But I don't think I can change that now to be active in this meeting.
Try one thing, Step. So at the bottom of the list of participants where it's got invite and mute all and then 3 dots.
Yeah.
Click on the 3 dots and see if you can do it there.
No, I looked at that. That's where you did the change name thing, which I didn't know about.
Yeah. Okay. So you haven't got any additional functionality than I have there then.
No, I've got enable waiting room, the doorbell renaming, allowing people to unmute themselves so that it's, well, which is what we've got, which is different if it's a webinar. Yeah, so there's not an option. I think you have to do it in the app outside the meeting.
Well, I've managed to actually, when you go to share screen and the settings there, there's who can share all participants. So I've set it to who can share when someone else is sharing, all participants.
Okay, yeah, you changed that.
Multiple participants.
No, oh, okay.
Yeah,
no, don't change that one. That means multiple participants in the same bit.
Okay.
But if all participants, okay, right, then we can send a message.
Yeah.
Shall I do that?
Yeah.
I've lost the chat.
I think you can send.
Yeah, I can send.
You can broadcast a message to all saying you should be able to share your screens now.
Yeah. That's right. I've still got 9 minutes to do it. We knew something would go wrong.
Well, we've got some saved time because I didn't do the recap, so.
Right, you did it in the chat box. That's fine. Yeah, it was really good yesterday, Amelia. You should be really proud of that.
Yeah, no, I was. Well, I think I was a bit too tired yesterday to
it's exhausting.
Work out what was going on.
The Nepal lecture was good, but
that's also what I meant to say this morning. Was I hope everybody enjoyed the Nepal lecture.
Well, we only had about 38 people on the call, which was about half the number that had registered, but
that's okay.
And I suspect that Friday afternoon for a Zoom call may not be the best time, given that we had twice as many people yesterday when that was at short notice.
Yeah, exactly. I did just notice that earlier, that we had over 100 people yesterday and we had more like 60 today. So
yeah, but
well, we'll see. A few more people have, like at least 10 more people have come in now. So
yeah, yeah. And they'll have, when the clock stops, they'll have 2 minutes to come out of the room, so we don't need to send a reminder. Like, you know.
Yeah.
People having, don't send me IT issues that I can't solve.
What have they said now?
People having major bandwidth constraints. It's like, well, I can't do anything, I'm afraid.
Tell them to switch off their camera.
They have, yeah, it's fine.
Melvin's here today.
Who was here yesterday?
Oh, was he?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I didn't know if
oh, Chris is in rural Cambodia. That's quite a good reason.
Is that Chris Nixon?
Yeah.
Sorry, Chris. Good effort though.
I have to say, it is bizarre having these online meetings with people all around the world, you know, from your living room.
Yeah.
I mean, it just, you know, this would have been inconceivable not that long ago.
Yeah, it's quite a change. We can talk about the weather step.
I know, it's glorious. We should all be outside. I went to Victoria Park after yesterday's meeting and had an ice cream from the ice cream van. It was wonderful.
That's a nice idea. Hi newcomers. Hi Glynis. Would you like to go in a breakout room, or are you happy hanging out in the plenary until they come back?
I think they vanished again.
Finished again, yeah. Maybe they're having issues as well. What was the question for room 4?
Sorry?
It's okay, talking to myself.
Room 4 is Victoria. Oh, no, she's in room 2, sorry.
What is the most important issue in shelter and home-based work? Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I see what you're asking.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know. I'm just trying to find the room 4 seems quite popular, so I'm wondering which question it is.
Well, it's only Graham that asked to go in there.
Yeah, but in terms of numbers, they've got the most people.
Well,
anyway,
do we think Fee K is Fiona Kelling again?
Yeah.
Hello,
Elisa. Welcome, Elisa. Elisa, if you'd like to join a breakout room, then please let us know.
There's only a couple of minutes left, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, no problem. I can just wait for them to come back.
All right, great.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, we could also give them a little bit more time in the breakout room, just because we're ahead of time. But...
Okay.
Do you want to pop into a couple of the breakout rooms and see how they're getting on, Steph? You have the number to pop in and pop out again.
Well, given that we've got 1 minute left.
Yeah.
They can use the 2 minutes. That's
okay.
That's an extra 10% for free.
Are you sure they get an extra 2 minutes?
Yes, that's what I said.
Okay, all right.
And then we can have a bit of plenary.
Okay, great.
So David, welcome. We won't assign you into a breakout room because they're about to end. So if you don't mind hanging on, we'll, yeah, great. I don't know, Amelia, what happens about recordings in breakout rooms?
There isn't any.
Okay, yeah.
That's why we have the plan. That's why they come back.
Right, so shall I close them?
Yeah, maybe just let them finish their sentences.
Well, it will give them the 2 minutes.
Yeah, go then.
Yeah. Yeah, there we go.
Hi, everybody.
No, they're not back yet.
Oh, maybe, I think maybe when you press close, it gave them 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Right.
But,
Yeah.
but that will come up. It will be counting down in the breakout room so they can see.
75 seconds to go.
No, this is good. We've got sort of 10 minutes for a bit of plenary feedback.
Perfect.
Hi, Anthony. We're just closing some breakout rooms, so bear with us, and everyone should be back here shortly. Yep, here they come.
Welcome back, everybody. People are filtering in. That long walk back from the breakout room to the plenary room.
Okay, hello.
Hi.
So I think you have to go back to the presentation, or should I share my PowerPoint or you?
Someone will share it again. I think we're nearly back at full capacity. Are you happy to share your screen?
Okay, yeah.
Oh, no, wait.
So I will share my screen. For some reason I can't. Zoom is not showing me the right window, but I found it now.
Okay, great. Okay.
Okay, next, please.
Is that working?
Yes,
that's working. Let's go to the next slide. Lovely.
Yeah, so we have 5 minutes left. I think the idea is to share what we have been, 10 minutes, we have been discussing in our groups. Next, please. So we discussed about how would you describe and how we understand home-based work, and we have a very short, because we don't have much time, discussion, and we would like to have more time, of course. But some of the main topics were that this is related to flexibility in terms of the house that can be used in different ways, but also in terms of hours. So when you have a home-based work, you can go to childcare, to work, to do something else. So it's related to flexibility, not only in the physical space, but also time, and also because you can do it easily from a small scale to something bigger. So flexibility was one of the main concepts. Another one is that it's often done by women alongside looking after children. Also is something important that we also found in the literature and was mentioned in the discussion. Also, we found that there is a dark side here that can be open to exploitation, but also suitable for cooperatives. So we have on the one side that it can be easy, it can be helpful, but at the same time open to exploitation, and we should have pay attention to that. And finally, we have the it can help to have a cooperative or to improve help in the settlement between the or in the area between different households. It can be something for the community. So those are the main topics that we talk. Next, please.
Yeah, so I'll quickly summarize. We had lots of really good examples put on our little Google Draw of examples of shelter and home-based work from practice, but just to flag a few things. So in our little diagram showing where home-based work might take place within the home, it's pointed out that we might have forgotten the roof, because sometimes people use the roof for storage of livelihood items, particularly agricultural inputs. And a really good example was given from Haiti, where people had these items on the roof, and they're also kind of weighing down the roof. So if it got really windy, it was being thought of as being used as a kind of mitigation against that. We also had a good discussion about the importance of verandas and how we often forget them in shelter design. They're quite often used not only for livelihoods, but also for social reasons. So they kind of have that dual purpose. We had a bit of a discussion around an informal settlement upgrade in Burkina Faso, where lots of the requests from people living there were linked to home-based work, which is quite interesting. We had a very brief discussion on the relocation and the importance of either transport or understanding people's livelihoods during relocation. And finally, we were speaking briefly about needs assessments and thinking about, whilst we ask about livelihoods, we don't necessarily ask about whether or not they're in the home. So maybe in some of our guidance, we need to just be a little bit clearer about, okay, what is your livelihood? Where does it take place? So because then that can help us inform our programming. So that was me. Next slide, please.
Thanks. We had a slightly more sprawling conversation, but a number of things were mentioned. I think highlighting the fact that it's about shelter being close to markets, whether that's the market coming to you or you going to the market. Some challenges within the sector about thinking of shelters being a short-term funding or moving on too quickly to actually ever really get to livelihood. So maybe a change in our thinking about kind of when that takes place. Looking, or just a flag to look at the differences between what home-based work might look like in rural, peri-urban or urban settings, because there's differences in how that might appear and what we might need to consider. A really important point about this, about security of tenure, just being vital for people to be able to invest in home-based businesses, use it as collateral against loans or grants, and also to reduce the risk of exploitation if you do invest. And then, yeah, just a couple of points around kind of like what comes first. Is it the chicken or the egg, shelter first or livelihoods first? Both of them support each other. And often in many cases, the people are kind of already doing it. So it's more us looking at what is needed most and taking that as our starting point, rather than being more prescriptive. Yeah, thanks.
Next, hi. So I think our topic was a little bit different because we were trying to talk about future research priorities. So we had a bit of a discussion about more detail about how we'd done the research so far and what we'd included and what we'd excluded. We had a discussion around, you know, what's the purpose of doing the work and the importance of the research should contribute to learning around how can shelter programs and shelter recovery catalyze livelihood recovery. And we were warned that there is a danger that we might be focusing too much on home-based work, and we need to explain it within the context of livelihood recovery more generally. one person was interested in greater research and understanding about how home-based work requires inputs in terms of goods and services and access to markets, and then it also itself has outputs in terms of goods or services and also waste products, and what are the linkages of those within the settlement or the city. We had a good discussion about intersectionality, and we didn't mention it in the main presentation, but things like disabled people, how much research is there on that topic in relation to home-based work, and it is something, and I answered that it is something that we did find in the broader scoping study, but not within the development and the humanitarian literature. So that is something that we can build on, and we were advised that if we were to go on and research that topic, this is a really good point, that if we want to work with disabled people, for example, that it's the importance of building trust to involve people in research projects. Who are you working with? How are you building the trust? How are you truly involving people? And then we had a discussion, interesting point about rental accommodation. In the research, that's one of the reasons why we broadened the research from home-based enterprises to home-based work, so that we could include rental as a form of income generation. But of course, rental is a form of shelter. So actually, there are two ways that we can look at rental accommodation in the research. And shelter design and material choice. For example, how much of the home-based work is a fire hazard, and how is that incorporated into shelter design? That was us. Next.
Yeah, so I think we've got like 1 minute left, so I'll can't try and quickly wrap up. Yeah, so just want to say big thanks to everyone for engaging with this topic, because we think it's quite interesting and we think it's an overlooked part of our practice and in research. So it's been really great to have your inputs today. So next slide, please. So the kind of next steps, you've probably heard loads already about the roadmap for research, but we did write a chapter for this. It should be out soon. We've also got the global scoping study, which is ongoing, which we will write up, and the LAC study as well. Hope, fingers crossed, that Elizabeth's proposal in Chile will be successful, so some research can be conducted there. And we're going to continue on the housing and home-based work in humanitarian settings, with Fiona supporting on that as well. So that's great. Next slide, please. So all of those strands of work being said, if you are interested to receive a copy of any of these pieces of work, or just want to stay in touch about this, then please fill in the form there. Hopefully someone can put a link in the chat, or you can just copy it off the screen. And if anyone's got any particular interest in the research in LAC, please can you get in touch with Elizabeth, and she'll be more than happy to have a chat with you about future research in LAC. But yeah, just to reiterate, many thanks, and yeah, see you all soon, hopefully virtually in the pub later.
Great, thank you so much, Beth. Thank you so much, Victoria, Elizabeth and Fiona, and I hope everybody enjoyed that session. So we are now going into a break, so you can all run off and get an emergency sandwich or a banana or a coffee or whatever you fancy. Could you please try and be back by 2:20 UK time on the dot, so we can start punctually. So that's
with some updates on projects from IOM. Joseph, are you there or Laura? Is one of you kicking off this section? Or Boshra?
I think Joseph's up.
Yeah, sorry, I am.
Oh, sorry, there we go.
Yeah, so I am not Laura Heykoop. I'm Joseph Ashmore. She's temporarily unwell, but she'll be back on it on Monday, I'm sure. So I am working for IOM in Geneva, and we're going to now present 3 projects, which are all done on behalf of as an interagency project, so on behalf of the Global Shelter Cluster, in the next 20 minutes. So I will start with this one, Shelter Projects, if I can have the next slide. So Who has not heard of shelter projects? Put your hand up. There should be a hand option somewhere. I'm not going to go into length at what it is. Go to shelterprojects.org and you will see it. But it's a lot of work. It's over 250 case studies. You can see the front covers here. They're done. I think it's the most kind of longest running interagency shelter publication that we have. And it's based on pretty much I can see many people here who've contributed to it. So it's based on all of your work and your agency's work, and it compiles a series of practices on shelter programming. If I can have the next slide, please. We're currently developing the next issue, but what I really want to do today is focus on the current issue or the latest document we produced. So we'll probably we'll drop this in the chat as well. So if you go to shelterprojects.org/essentials.html, you will find a consolidated publication we have, which shows kind of recurring messages in shelter response that we have been able to derive from the case studies that we have. So it's a very simple introduction for people who don't know much about shelter. It's done in Adobe Spark, so it's quite smooth to scroll through, and we'll be releasing, I think, probably parts of this monthly over the next 12 months, a message a month. So as a spoiler, you can see the 12 messages here, which are, we formed a working group, we reviewed what the most recurrent themes are, and this is what we're seeing as on the left of this slide, the most recurrent themes that we are seeing in shelter programming. Let me pass to the next slide. There is a shelter photo competition as well we've just been having, so we'll have a growing image library. Again, if you go to shelterprojects.org, there is an image library there, which I've always found useful for presentations. If you want to find a picture of something that has been done in the shelter world, pretty likely that we will have it. So again, there's an image library, but really what I wanted to do today was highlight shelterprojects.org/essentials.html, which is where our latest publication was. If you watch this space, in probably about the next 2 months, we will expect to see the next edition, which will compile case studies that are probably around 30 case studies from the past few years. Without further ado, I'll pass over to Boshra, who will talk about the next project that we have, next interagency project that we've been working on. Over to you, which is really about how we communicate shelter ideas. Boshra.
Thanks, Joseph. Hi, everyone. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so the shelter compendium, I think most of you know it because you also contributed a lot of it to this work, but this is a database of reviewed IEC materials for shelter sector. It's the first time that we are collecting and consolidating the existing IEC materials in one place, so we can improve the coherence of messaging, we can understand where the gaps are and where the strengths are, and we can facilitate the development of messaging in future. Next slide, please. We're so happy that we can share with you now the overview publication of the Shelter Compendium. This publication has 3 chapters. The first one is the introduction. It includes the background, the methodology that we use to collect and annotate all the IEC materials that are in the database right now. We have around 700 files in the database right now, and the learnings that we had during the process. The second section includes case studies and opinion pieces, and the third one has the selected 23 IEC materials with the feedbacks of the reviewers. Next slide, please. It's very interesting to mention that when we started this work, we looked around in our sector to see if we have actually a definition of IEC materials, and we couldn't find any. So we used the relatable definition from WHO that defines IECs as an approach, and the material that support this approach are called IEC materials. So in this publication, we try to use the term IEC materials to stress that these are the materials and should be part of a process and not a standalone solution. Next one. So in the introduction, you can see the methodology that we used. We started with 3,000 files. We narrowed it down to 1,000, and right now we have 700 IST files in the database. We used the below taxonomy to do the data entry and annotated the files, and we did different stage of reviews with different experts. Next one. And right now we can analyze our database. For example, we can see that most of the materials that we have are on construction in in most of the regions. Next one. We can see the type of hazard that these IECs are trying to reduce the risk of. We can see that cyclone and earthquakes are among the most, and this is also related to the frequency of disaster in the regions. And on the right, you can see that the context that the material was created on, for example, conflict, and the hazards that they're trying to reduce the risk of. And it's interesting to see, for example, in Africa, we have floods as one of the main hazards that we try to reduce the risk of, while the context was conflict. Next one. We highlighted 7 key messages in this publication that we want everyone to kind of remember while going through it. The first one is that communication is a two-way street, and the materials should be created in consultation with the targeted audience. Then that the process of developing IC material is as important as the material themselves, while it's sometimes being overlooked. The third one is that access to information is a right for all. And it's not only the technical accuracy of the IECs that is important, but how accessible and inclusive the information is to as many as people as possible, regardless of age, disability, gender, and others. That the IEC material evolve as the response evolves. So during the response, the information gap should be monitored, and if it's needed, new materials should be developed or the materials should be modified. IEC material in the sector can generally benefit from an evaluation and review of their impact. We couldn't find many, actually we found very few studies on this, and we think that this is something to look more in the sector. And some messages never change. We saw that one message that was created years ago, it's keep being repeated in different locations and being copy-pasted. And that, again, that IC materials are not a solution, and they should be contextualized and have a clear rollout strategy. Otherwise, the impact that we want will never reach. Next one. So the second section, as I mentioned, is the case studies and opinion pieces, and we use this image of an anthill to show how, when we see an IC material, we often overlook the process behind it, which includes different things. It includes politics, consultation, coordination, and a lot of other stuff that we try to highlight and point to them in the 10 case studies that we have as much as possible. So I invite everyone to have a look to them. Next one. And since this one was very interesting, I'm just showing this one case study here that shows how the IC material on fixing tarpaulins all came from a book in 1973, and first 1 or 2 ICs and that, and later it started being used in different locations, and the same images keep being repeated. Next one. So the third section is the reviews. We have 23 IC materials in this section that are reviewed by experts on different criteria, and we try to select them in a way that they cover different range of activities that we do, from fire safety, fixing of tarpaulin, to construction, winterization, cash-based interventions. And here we chose this elephant here to tell a story that when and related to actually to the current situation, that when you take the ICs out of context and don't consult with the people, you can never expect that they understand the same thing as you do. So when you put an elephant in a dark room and people don't know what that is, they can come and touch different parts and think that this is a different thing. Next one. In this section, you often see the reviews on the left side, and the IEC on the right side. And next one. On the top, the stars show the overall evaluation. There's a box below it that has the background or any other information that we can gather from the people who were involved on those responses before. Below, you can see the different rating that the IEC got on different criteria, some quotations from the reviewers, and the small box that is called communication tips. Next one. And on the communication tips, there are very different topics that emerged during this work that we wanted to touch on them shortly, and very different resources that are interesting to check, starting from if people can understand the drawing of a shelter, or the trust relation that you need for communicating the messages, the information that you can communicate on PSEA or CBI or diaspora or HLP or other stuff. Next one. And here I just have 2 or 3 examples. The first one is the IFRC shelter kit that was reviewed by 30 reviewers that we did in purpose to see how the opinion of different reviewers in our sector and different experts varies. And you can see that actually it varies very much. Next one. Here, for example, one of the reviewers mentioned that this IC could include a picture of the shelter that is not properly prepared and got damaged. And this actually links very well with the study that CRS did on the existing impacts of the responses, and they mentioned explaining the consequences as one of the factors of changing the behavior. Next one. This IC from Philippines that is one of the few ones that has an impact assessment, and we summarized the important parts here that you can see next to the IC and next to the evaluations from the reviewers, and very interesting points that are highlighted in both. Next one. We also highlighted if there is a potential that this IC can cause harm, both from the technicality or how the images are drawn. For example, here the image is not very clear if this is suggesting people to do this or not. And this can potentially cause harm for people if they get the wrong idea. Next one. Or here, sorry. Okay, yeah, and here there were, for example, some comments from the reviewers on technical clarity of this message or accuracy, because some people thought that the message might cause actually harm if this is not the case. Like, should people have trees? Should we build our shelter next to tall trees to protect from the wind, or would the tree then fall out on your shelter? And the last slide. And the exciting news is that finally our website is functioning, and you can go to iec.sheltercluster.org, and among the 700 ICs that we can have, you can narrow down your search by different filters and find the IC that you want. You can see the comments of the reviewers, etc. This is still the version 1 of the website, and we will improve it later. So if you still have some IECs that you want to share with us, please contact us at iec@sheltercluster.org. Thanks.
Back to me, if I can have the next slide. So just in summary, the 2 projects, shelter projects and the IEC compendium, have only been possible by the generous donation of many of you and many other people. So they've really been collective efforts to kind of consolidate what they've both been trying to consolidate what we know as terms of best practices or of materials. I'm going to show one final document today, which we've worked on and shared previously, which is on post-distribution monitoring. So it's targeted at people working in shelter programming, and tries, I like it, it's a kind of nice little guide, brief introduction to statistics, and addresses some fairly difficult issues. So how do you do post-distribution monitoring working also with people who haven't received assistance, because if you obviously want to find out more about targeting, you need to talk to both those who have received and those who have not received assistance. So I think in going through this, we did quite a lot of thinking about how do you do post-distribution monitoring, how do you do assessments, and came up with some mixture of statistics, but also practical guidance on how you develop teams. So again, I will share a link to this here. It's available on the Shelter Cluster website, and it's part of a suite of tools that we initially started with CARE. I think it's even probably close to CARE's Orange, that we focused on good programming. So good programming in terms of reducing gender-based violence risks through good shelter programming. This was a kind of third part of that. We've been looking at site planning, we've been looking at distribution, and this is really the kind of post-distribution monitoring part of it. So again, a free resource for you all, welcome to have a look, and again developed with the support of many of you. So thank you very much all for your support, and we hope you find these 3 documents and projects interesting and useful, critically. Tom, back to you.
Thank you. Where can they find, just remind us, where can they find that guidance? Is it on the Shelter Cluster website?
Yep, there is a link that Boshra has just pasted in the chat. So in the chat, we have links to the shelterprojects.org essentials, to the PDF of the IEC compendium and to the IEC website, as well as this PDM guidance.
Perfect.
So all in the chat, and they'll be in the minutes
very
too.
Much. Thank you very much. With that, we go straight on to interaction and the roadmap for research. Hilmi, are you starting this off?
And Andrea, Andrea, go ahead.
Andrea.
Yes. Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Andrea, and I'm here with Interaction as a program associate for the Humanitarian Policy and Practice team. And we'll later be joined by Kirsty Farmer, Alex Robinson, and Mohammed Hilmi as we delve deeper into the roadmap for research. Next slide, please. All right, one more. Thank you. All right, so first off, we'd like to thank all those who submitted chapters and to the editors, so John Twigg, Lizzie Babister, copy editor Kate Murphy, for their tireless effort into really bringing this into fruition. Special thanks also to Livia, and another special thanks to BHA at USAID for their ongoing support. Now, to give some background, Roadmap for Research brings together academics and practitioners from the humanitarian fields who aim to really tackle and bring attention to some of the biggest challenges and gaps experienced in the shelter and settlement sector. Essentially, these chapters are shortened proposals of initiatives that need to be taken on, and it lays the groundwork for it. And the expected publication date is later in May. Next slide, please. Thank you. So 18 chapters can be broadly categorized into about 6 thematic themes, and this includes environment, so quantifying the environmental footprint, focusing in on vulnerable groups such as LGBT or children as well, and then conflicts and local practices, so promoting self-help and incorporating local building practices and so forth. Next slide, please. As well as livelihoods, disaster risk, and protection and participation. And this ranges from exploring the role of livelihoods in shelter, to integrating geoscience, to defining what makes a good house. Next slide, please. So here's a sample of one of those chapters. It addresses the diversity of gender and sexuality, really goes into exploring the exclusion and discrimination of diverse SOGS, which also refers to LGBTQI, given that there's very little research on this topic, and it goes into the impact of pre-emergency marginalization and how we can strengthen and support responses to ensure not only the inclusion, but also taking into account the unique experiences and livelihoods of those of the LGBTQ community. Next slide. Another chapter here really promotes children's participation in design. So making sure they are part of these built interventions, making sure their voices are taken into account, as well as their agency, and it seeks to really understand the impact of what this would do, not only to their well-being, but to their families and to their communities. Next slide, please. All right, and to delve deeper into this, we have Kirsty Farmer, who's going to tell us more about her chapter on exploring women's tenure security. Kirsty, are you there?
Hello, yes, thank you. Thanks, Andrea. So our chapter proposes research on women's tenure security in shelter and settlement. So very quickly now, in the short time that we have, we're going to, I'm just going to give a very quick overview of 4 of those aspects. So the first one is the gap in the knowledge that we propose to address with the research. The second is on women's tenure security in shelter programming. Then we'll look at the research question very quickly. And finally, how we propose that the research is useful in shelter and settlements programming. If we start with the gap in knowledge, there's a growing evidence of the extent of violence against women in humanitarian contexts. And often some of the most prevalent forms of violence are within the household. So that's from intra-household violence. We know also that shelter assets and services are most often delivered at the household level, most often, again, to male heads of households. But what we don't understand is enough about how different members of a household benefit from the shelter intervention, or how this affects the power dynamics within the household. So now, if we look particularly with the example of women's security of tenure, of course, security of tenure is part of the right to adequate housing. And it's also outlined in the sphere standards in the shelter chapter, which does emphasize women's security of tenure. The reason for this is because we know women are already excluded from housing and land tenure because of a range of factors, including traditional norms, discriminatory laws. So they're already at a disadvantage when it comes even before the crisis. Often humanitarian a conflict exacerbates this crisis. And what we do also know is that humanitarian programs can exclude women on the basis of this. Because of this reason, they've tried to address a lot of this in shelter interventions. So this is through joint names on documents, or putting shelter even in women's names. And some of these have been really important to address discrimination. But overall, what we don't know about this is the effect on the power relations of this intervention inside the household, and on the dynamics of violence in particular. In other studies outside the sector, we are starting to see that there can be an increased risk of the violence against women when women claim any types of rights or control over housing and land. So in humanitarian settings, when women step forward to claim inheritance rights, for example, that can increase their risk of violence. In the past, we've relied a lot on development literature, which has found a correlation. When women have stronger tenure rights, their risk of violence is decreased, but this has not seemed to be the case always in conflict-affected countries, and especially the ones we encounter in humanitarian response. So there is really mixed results on that, that causality. And because of this, there is a potential to do harm in our shelter programming overall, and in particular, those that support women's security of tenure. So the research that we have proposed in the chapter is, how do shelter and settlements programs that support women's security of tenure, how do they affect the dynamics of inter-household violence? So in terms of methodology, we don't have a lot of time to go into this. It's in the chapter already. 2 things I just wanted to highlight about this. Obviously, tenure security is very difficult to measure. The default is to look from a legal perspective on legal documentation, and we know that this doesn't necessarily correlate with tenure security, and particularly women's experience. So one of the elements of looking at tenure security is to understand it from women's own perceptions, their experience of their tenure security within their household, and their knowledge and understanding of tenure arrangements in their household vis-a-vis other members of their household. Also, a really important point is looking at this type of research, anything to do with violence against women, we would need to have a partnership across the sectors, particularly with GBV partners. So this research has to be done in a place where there is a strong GBV partner and civil society presence, not just because of the need for ethical research and the skills and the expertise that these organizations and colleagues hold, but also because of the need to refer to services, as well as the capacity building of the staff. And then for the final point, what would be proposed in terms of the use of the research? Well, first of all, one of the main reasons that we don't know about the linkages between violence against women and interventions in shelter and settlements, specifically in security of tenure, is because there's a lack of longitudinal studies. So one of the things that the research would contribute to is longitudinal studies looking better at monitoring and evaluation, and ultimately at accountability. We would also use that to obviously build the capacity of anybody who works on shelter and settlements programming to understand the risks of violence in their programming. I mean, Joseph mentioned this before within IOM and the series of work that they've done on this, and we see that this would add a body of knowledge to be able to really improve the programming. And then finally, of course, it can contribute to the understanding of violence against women in humanitarian crisis overall, how humanitarian response can potentially do harm, or how it can mitigate the risk for women in their programs, as well as then in the future, linking up with a development perspective of looking at gender transformative programming and all the links with livelihoods that were covered really well in the previous session run by Fiona. That's it for now. Thank you. A bit of a whirlwind tour. We're happy to take any questions or comments afterwards. Thank you.
All right, so are there any questions, comments?
No, let's move on to Alex, please.
All right, Alex, are you there?
Yeah, yes, I am. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning or good evening, wherever you might be. My name is Alex Robinson. I'm heading up the disability inclusion team at the Nossal Institute for Global Health at the University of Melbourne. And next slide, please. I'd just like to acknowledge the co-authors on this chapter, and that's Leanne Marshall from the Australian Red Cross, also Victoria Maynard from University College London, and George Curie from the National Association for the Rights of Disabled People in Lebanon. Next slide, please. Okay, I'd like to just briefly, I understand I've only got 5 minutes, so just briefly give you a little bit of background and then introduce what we are proposing for the research and why. So just to start off, I mean, if you've looked at disability inclusion recently, you definitely will have seen this figure of 15%. We estimate that around 15% of the world's population are people with disability, which makes them the world's largest minority. Those figures vary. In some countries, in this region, in Asia, you might have prevalence figures around 3%, 1%, 1.5% even. Here in Australia, it's up around 18%, Georgia's around 20%. So it really varies on what questions are asked and how disability is defined. But for a working guide, we can assume that 15% of the world's population of communities that we're working in will be people with disability. We also know that women, men, girls, boys with disabilities are disproportionately affected by disasters. And also, this is natural hazard emergencies and also conflict. And within that, we see higher mortality rates, we see higher risks of injury, and that all builds on what we know pre-disaster, which are lower health outcomes, lower educational attainment, less likely to be in work or to have meaningful work, and just this general negative impacts from exclusion. So it's not specifically new. That people with disability have been excluded from response has been discussed since the 80s. But really since the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, 2006, that came into force in 2008, there's been accelerated interest. And that really, I suppose, took off around 2015 with the 2030 Agenda, the Sendai Framework, and then Humanitarian Disability Charter, which came out of the World Humanitarian Summit. And more recently, we've seen the Humanitarian Inclusion Standards as a sphere companion, and the IASC Disability Inclusion Guidelines in 2019. The jumping off point for this proposed research are really, I suppose, two key bits of work. One is a gap analysis on the inclusion of older people and people with disability in humanitarian response. And that really showed that with all these initiatives, an increasing number of guidelines, there's really growing awareness within the humanitarian sector as a whole. But we're still not seeing that actions are clearly resulting in improved inclusion outcomes. The spread of evidence still remains very thin across sectors and overall quite limited. Importantly, we're also seeing there's very limited evidence on the participation of people with disability in response, in design, in implementation, in monitoring and evaluation as well. There's also a further concern that general guidance on disability inclusion is not really meeting the needs of different sectors. If you like, there are probably there's a trilogy of common advice on disability inclusion. Partner with people with disability would be one. The second would be collect and disaggregate data by disability, and the third would be apply a twin track approach. That those three have been, I think, very successful in raising awareness and as advocacy tools, and they remain very important. But what we're seeing is more demand for sector-specific guidance. And within the shelter sector, this has been supported, and these findings have been mirrored by a 2019 study mapping exercise by the Global Shelter Cluster Working Group on Disability Inclusion. Next slide, please. So we propose to conduct research in Lebanon and Indonesia, so two very different contexts, obviously for the purposes of comparison. And the first thing I want to say is, to what extent can a co-research process that includes researchers with disabilities contribute to improving disability inclusion within organizations? The second question is, to what extent can this process, this co-research process, contribute to providing technical disability expertise to shelter practitioners? So first and foremost, we really want to address this issue of a lack of participation by people with disability in response. We're also concerned that the process of adoption, organizational change hasn't been particularly rapid. To be frank, it's been quite slow in terms of becoming more disability inclusive in our work. And we hope that by this co-research process, we can generate a pool of people with disability that can act as resource people in the future. So obviously part of that is making sure that we're speaking the same language, that working with organizations of people with disability and responders, we would be really making sure that we're recognizing and understanding each other's goals and where sort of aspirations converge. So really what we hope to be the outcome from this research is a better understanding of where blockages to disability inclusion might be, improved shared understanding between humanitarian actors and also organizations of people with disability, and Finally, can we establish a pool of resources and disability expertise that can be drawn on when needed? And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Alex. Are there any questions?
Sorry, can any questions please be put in the chat? There's no time.
Yes, so Liz Palmer, is there any research specifically for children with disabilities?
No, sorry, questions need to be asked and answered in the chat. I'm afraid we haven't got time.
Apologies. Okay, go ahead, Helmi, for your closing remarks.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Alex and Kirsty, Andrea. I would also again like to thank the publication is coming in a couple of weeks, 3 weeks maybe. Thanks for John, Lizzie, Kate for doing a wonderful job. I think we reached kind of a good mix of people in terms of gender. In authorship, roughly about 50% women. We don't have other breakdowns yet, but we will look at it. The topics are also, as Andrea explained, it's very diverse, so it's worth the investigation. We encourage donors and others to fund some of these research. On the other hand, we do have less than 10% of the authors or contributors from low and middle income countries or institutions. This needs to change. It is even worse in the abstract. When we received 35 abstract in the start, there was 3% from LMIC countries. I think we can do better in terms of research, in terms of practice, to consult people whose problem we're trying to resolve and research. The other part of it is while all of these, some of these are very needed research, I think we need evidence and stuff, but also the current context of humanitarian issues are very different. In Burkina Faso, for example, 3 to 10% of the people receive basic shelter assistance. 1.6 million people displaced, I think, the last number. So, but you can expand this into Yemen, DRC, CAR. A lot of the research don't deal with how do we change this situation? How do we reach these people between scale, quality, impact, and the need? I think some of those research probably would help. It's probably a difficult problem to resolve, but I think there's research needed in those things. Next slide, please. Yeah, so Shelter and Settlement Working Group meets monthly. You don't need to wait for the next UK Shelter Forum or Global Shelter Cluster Forum. Our next meeting is on Tuesday. Please join if you have any other issues, agendas we can take on, and we can discuss there as well. So shelter@interaction.org. Thank you. Thanks, Tom and the team for opportunity.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. So can I just ask the speakers there to just check for any questions in the chat and get back to them. There are also some really interesting things, further resources people have been putting in the chat. Oh, sorry, my computer's going mad. So next we have Arwin Soelaksono from the Red Cross to talk about community-based seismic retrofitting program. Go ahead, Arwin.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity that I can share our work in this forum. I am Arwin Soelaksono from the American Red Cross, and I'm looking forward to talking with you about community-based seismic retrofitting program for disaster risk reduction in Indonesia. The program is being implemented by Indonesian Red Cross and supported by the American Red Cross and funded by the USAID. The program is take place at the city and at sub-district, which are located in the earthquake-prone area. I will share the process from retrofitting, which actually not quite familiar in pre-disaster context, to potentially can be done in large scale through a community-based effort. Next slide, please. Thank you. In Indonesia, we have building codes, as you can see at the slide, how to design earthquake-resistant structure, how to design concrete structure, and so on. The code also available for structural elements such as beam, column, foundation, and so on. The code is expected to be a guidance for a design and prerequisite to get building permit. It is, but mostly only at multi-story buildings, not at 1- or 2-story landed houses. In rural area, it's even more challenging. Construction practices are far different from the code. For instance, in our working area in Sukabumi, West Java, as can be seen at the slide, the houses has no column. They lay the brick at the stretcher face, not at their bed. People do this because they want to save money by putting less brick. It is common that people construct brick gable wall without concrete frame, which make their house are quite vulnerable when the earthquake occur. The risk if the brick gable wall falls off, it can endanger the house owner since it is catastrophic. Next slide, please. Yeah, we conducted some interviews and discussion with the homeowners and builders prior the project started last year. They don't have sufficient information on how to construct their house properly. Some of them willing to take risk by saving money to have larger houses instead of safer houses. Even we told them that the areas are in earthquake-prone area, they're still reluctant to change their practices and still unwilling to retrofit their houses. In certain area, they live in densely populated settlement, which there is no safe place either inside of the house or outside of the house when earthquake occur. House might collapse in every direction. Furthermore, the debris might block the evacuation route. Before the program started, we checked the builders and construction material available in the market. It is not many builders with good skills available, and many times they have to follow instruction from the homeowner to reduce the construction cost. There is no building inspection during the construction either. And as a common practice, the homeowner just pay the masons and carpenters to build their houses. Regarding the construction material, it is quite difficult to find material that needed for earthquake-resistant structure, such as deformed steel rebar and wire mesh in local shops. Next slide, please. Thank you. We said that retrofitting cost is around 30% of total cost of new house construction. And it might be less even than 30% if we can reach economies of scale. The current challenges are there are still insufficient number of builders with retrofitting skills. Those builders without retrofitting skills always told the homeowners that retrofitting is always expensive. Therefore, they propose build new houses rather than retrofitting. And homeowners tend to listen to them and prefer to construct a new house, even they know, as we told them, the construction practice is poor, rather than they modify the house element to achieve earthquake-resistant structure. Some seismic retrofitting is already introduced on several post-disaster programs. It is one of the options on rebuilding houses, and people already encouraged to do so. On pre-disaster situation is quite rare to retrofit houses. People already lived in their house for many years without earthquake in certain magnitude which predicted by the earthquake expert. Also, it is common that people adding more rooms or put new paint of their houses. For special occasions, they have budget or borrow money to renovate their house, even though retrofitting is not in their budget since seismic safety is not in their priority. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, how to make retrofitting is accessible to many people, but not sacrificing its quality and safety. We know that retrofitting is a little bit complicated compared to the construction of a new house. Retrofitting always needs proper planning, and during the implementation should be supervised by skilled and experienced people with engineering background. This is to ensure safety and quality and its cost effective. But it is still a challenge to achieve large-scale retrofitting. Therefore, on designing the program, we made some limitation. To some extent, people should be able to retrofit their houses, which are only for single-story brick houses, which is most of the housing stock in the area. Then we have to provide retrofitting training to local builders and Indonesian Red Cross volunteers. We have to have sufficient number of trained builders and experienced personnel if we want to scale up number of retrofitted houses. There were two methods of seismic retrofitting given during the training. The first is the conventional one, such as how to put column, changing the gable wall, and so on. On this method, Bill Change delivered the training, including providing the training manual. Other method that we introduced was retrofitting with ferrous cement, which developed by Teddy Boone. Currently, retrofitting with ferrous cement is widely introduced by Teddy Boone across Indonesia. Having two methods of retrofitting is intended to give homeowners more option on retrofittings to suit their needs and their capacity. Aside of local builders, community-based action team of Indonesian Red Cross who already participated on the training, they expected to have a new role as retrofitting agent. They will be able to promote retrofitting to their neighbor. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So the difficult question needs to be answered is how to create demand for retrofitting. Skilled builders and retrofitting agents should be seen as the backbone of the retrofitting campaign. To make them more effective, there are other initiatives should be carried out to complement effort. Currently, Indonesian Red Cross is developing strategic level collaboration with the public works and housing to reshape the government program. It is expected that the current house renovation program, which funded by the government, can be changed to house retrofitting. More retrofitted houses also means more training for builders. Indonesian Red Cross also trying to develop partnership with provincial banking institution that they may provide loan for retrofitting aside for house renovation, which already in their program. Another campaign by the retrofitting agent is using the retrofitted houses, which already finished, as a retrofitting showcase. People invited to visit the house, discuss with homeowners and the retrofitting agent. This campaign was launched to create bandwagon effect in the community. Still, more efforts need to be made. Supply chain is one important area need to be developed. The need of affordable construction retrofitting material, such as deformed bar, wire mesh, polypropylene bands, or fiber reinforced concrete paint, reinforced paint, should be available in local shop. At the end, it will reduce the cost. Collaboration with other humanitarian organization programs such as livelihood and other needs to be developed. Improved quality of the society will increase homeowner capacities. Then at the end, they may retrofit their house. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to have your feedback and answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and please do put any questions you have in the chat, and Arwin will be able to answer them there. We're going to our last presentation for this session, which is from Better Shelter on their latest shelter development called Structure, something that I think we'll all be quite pleased to see as a clear development of transitional shelter, which from early work done by Shelter Centre and onwards. So over to you, David.
Thank you so much, Tom. My name is David Karpathakis Thalén. I'm head of product development at Better Shelter, and just as Tom said, I will talk you through a little bit of our work with Structure, a modular shelter that lasts throughout the duration of displacement. So next slide, please. So just as Tom said in the introduction, it is a new approach in quotation marks. It's based on research done by Shelter Centre back from 2004, 2005, I think, on the transitional tent. So the structure is both the product and the process to be able to provide shelter both in emergency and later on and in transitional phases. Structure is also a pop culture brand that we have created and started and piloted in North America under createstructure.org, which aims to drive funds from private sector through a different kind of approach. And through this fundraiser, we will be able to provide this structure to humanitarian partners. So next slide, please. What we aim out to do, and what the sort of transitional tent approach describes, is to be able to provide an emergency shelter, which is basically the frame of the better shelter, and clad that with tarpaulin in the emergency phase. Then later on, as the funding stream continues, you will be able to upgrade it with local material, either sort of paid for by organizations or by beneficiaries themselves, and it can work in an incremental approach, adding material on as they are available, either through open supply chain or from increased funding. And at the end stage, obviously being able to repurpose, reuse, and recycle these materials to elongate the lifespan of the materials, and so for reducing the carbon footprint of the shelter approach. All of this being intended that the structure being the frame and tarpaulin to land at a cost below a normal sort of emergency tent, but that the main part of the material can be reused in transitional phase and ultimately in reconstruction. So next slide, please. The actual product part of the process then is a sturdy steel frame. Assembly time is about 1 to 2 hours, and then adding on the tarpaulin. The lifespan of this frame is expected to be quite substantial, obviously depending a little bit on how you maintain it. The core idea of the frame is based on sphere standard for shelter, and this is one thing that Shelter Center has also helped us evaluate throughout the pilot that we have driven to see how well the structure product and the structure approach cohorts to the sphere standard. So it provides in the basic packaging a 17.5 square meter shelter. It comes in 2 small boxes of a volume of 0.14 cubic meters. And you can load about 288 of these structures into one 40-foot Heykoop container. We have also tested it for wind stability, so it can withstand high wind loads, etc. Next slide, please. As mentioned, sorry, one back. Oh, my apologies. Forward. Thank you. The product itself and the process is also that we want to amplify and communicate local know-how, so that the frame itself is just a load-bearing structure, and then the cladding materials, we aim to collect data on these materials, case studies on it, similar to what Joseph Ashmore described before as well. Being able to respond with a simple case study with a simple BOQ can help solve problems elsewhere. So we want to collect these data. We have done it now throughout the pilot. We now have a very small library of some 10 or so different cladding techniques and materials in different contexts, and we wish to make those available and amplify the know-how among the humanitarian community and the shelter community at large. Next slide, please. So a bit of proof of concept. Initially, as I said, the frame itself is basically the inner core of the Better Shelter product, which has been deployed for more than 60,000 shelters worldwide. So we know that it works, and we know that it works on scale, and we know that it can be implemented in a variety of different settings. We have also conducted artificial wind and rain testing on a laboratory environment to make sure sturdiness, perform structural calculations to help guide different material choices and predict different outcomes from various climatic regions. We also started out with our first own field test with the kind support of our friends down in Gaziantep, where we built the first frame with tarpaulin back in January of 2020, and it's now still standing, and we are currently recording data on temperature and humidity within the shelter, so we can have a long-term record of that. Next slide, please. The next phase that we entered into was that we hired a contractor in Rwanda to perform construction work on the frame, see what local material was available, what local masonry skills were available, and basically figure out how we can attach a variety of materials onto the frame. We learned a lot from this part, both what works and what doesn't work, but mainly we could showcase a few different examples and identify suitable materials as well as suitable attachment techniques that we then can help spread on to onboarding partners later on for our field pilot. Next slide, please. So in beginning of 2020, we endeavored in a partnership together with Aga Khan Agency for Habitat and Seeds India. In Tajikistan, the first units were deployed, initially planned to be used as staff facilities as well as some transitional shelters for the normal responses. But they were delivered early April and the pandemic hit us all. So actually all of the 15 shelters intended for the pilot were steered directly into ACA's COVID-19 response. So they were used as a triaging unit combined into a double unit outside of the main hospital in Khorog. They were set up scattered around the region of eastern Tajikistan, used as search and rescue team bases for the volunteers of ACA, as well as their permanent staff, so they could stay in the shelters or store their facilities or just continue with the distribution of PPE or other NFI interventions in the region. We have followed this project throughout the year, and it has withstood harsh summer and harsh winter, and they basically look just as good now a year after implementation as they did when implemented. In Tajikistan, all of them were implemented with tarpaulin, although planned to be later disassembled and reassembled elsewhere with local material to turn into a more permanent structure. Next slide, please. We also piloted with ACA in Afghanistan. Parts of the shelter here were also used in the C-19 response. The picture to the left, you can see a local field hospital was built by better shelter units, and then the tarpaulin structure version was used as a changing room and office for the medical staff that operated the hospitals. It was also selected 2 different regions in Badakhshan and Pulikumri in Afghanistan, where 2 different versions were piloted with local materials and implemented using both skilled staff and unskilled staff in the implementation. Before that, we have went through a supply chain analysis. A selection of materials used was based on the fact on availability and mainly of a selection of choices that could be used by community involvement. So sort of selecting material that could easily be fitted into a training of trainer approach and then built at scale. This was done with insulation and heating modality as well, and are now being used as accommodation for relatives to patients admitted to the local hospital, as well as to guards for the main hospital. Next slide, please. In India, with our partner Seeds, we piloted in a few different locations. Started out by evaluating the design and evaluating possible options in the main office in Delhi. And then later on done in Uttarakhand and in Kerala, was implemented in a full approach with beneficiary selection, in the identification on the site, and then having a selection of material based on community involvement. So a few of the materials like the CGI and GI wire that was used for attachments was procured by the organization. The remaining material, the bamboo and areca nut and the plastering material, was all grown on site by the beneficiaries and selected and prepared on site. The finishing stages were also done completely by the community with plastering, internal walling, flooring and extensions with verandas, etc. Next slide, please. Here are just a few more pictures to illustrate. The top left is from the Gaziantep, about a year after we first built it, from Rwanda during the construction phase, from Afghanistan with the local material and the heating modality, as well as wintertime by the search units in Tajikistan. And on the next slide, we have a few more pictures, mainly from Rwanda and India, sort of halfway through the process when beneficiaries started to utilize the shelters, and these were selected and recently lost the shelter due to floodings in the region. Next slide, please. So next one. So some key findings. As I mentioned before, Shelter Center had helped us done a third-party assessment of the pilot interventions with the two partners. The main finding that we would have, and what we strive to do with piloting with our partners, was to prove that the structure approach can work both as an emergency and it can be incrementally upgraded using a variety of local materials. And by doing so, we can see that this works as a sort of practical solution to the transitional tent approach. What we still need to do is to verify that the materials chosen can in fact be reused and repaired in the reconstruction later. So I got a question in the chat here. The direct cost of the structure is $365 but as mentioned earlier before, we also aim to be able to fundraise for it and to be able to provide it basically free of charge to humanitarian partners as well through this new fundraising scheme. Next one, please. As I mentioned before as well, community involvement was one of the main things that was pushed for by our partners. The fact that the frame is predictable and easy to build makes it a good fit for a training of trainer approach, as well as the selection of the material works both with community involvement in selecting materials that they are familiar with and can work with and maintain, as well as creating sort of standard BOQs and standard proceedings that can be used in a training of trainer approach, something that was suggested by ACA, for example, to create a ready modality with ready material. Next one, please. As I mentioned a bit on programmatic differences, we can see that the low weight to volume ratio makes it suitable for emergency responses, both for stockpiling and as a fly-in solution. We have based the fact on standard plastic sheeting, mainly using the 4x6, but it could be done by the 4x5 or on roll solutions as well. We have not opted to try to design a ready-made fit or a ready-made top cladding, mainly because we can see that it works quite easily as an emergency solution to clad it with local tarpaulin, and then it's better to move as quickly on to local material, and we want to have as much of the material being bought and procured locally. Another idea is that the decision on what materials that be used can be decided upon later. You don't need to make that decision in the emergency phase, but knowing that the emergency solution that you are implementing can be reused later, and there is a wide variety of materials that can be used. We can also see that it can be implemented at scale through the training of trainer approach, and that the flexibility of the structure also makes it suitable for various modalities. For example, we are now exploring together with Seeds to build a school in a rural setting in Delhi and utilizing the frame there where a permanent structure is not allowed. So we're doing sort of semi-permanent structure that also can be disassembled. Next one, please. The main finding here as well is that there is further need for guidance and frameworks. And this is where we aim to kick off our work onwards. So we will continue to work with this. The initial ones is continue to collecting BOQs, as well as simple guidelines on sort of step-by-step instruction, a picture-based version that can be distributed to communities. Continue to collect BOQs on specific climate and country and context BOQs. And then onwards with more specific guidelines. One in regards to fire safety, where we have a lot of knowledge internally within Better Shelter from our work with our current shelter. And I saw a chat, I haven't read the full text yet, but will respond in the chat later on as well. Further guidance on heating modalities, guidance on plinth design and soil preparation is one thing that we also aim to give sort of a simple collection of various case studies on how you can prepare other things. This is also a recommendation from the Shelter Center report, indicating that there are other factors not directly linked to the shelter that could benefit from the approach by having readily available. Next one, please. Lastly, in findings, we have identified, not surprisingly, the need for wash and cooking and veranda extensions. And here the modularity of the structure frame works very well. Since it comes in about 1.8 meter elements, you could easily take part of a structure or come in at a second intervention later on to extend the solution. This is something that we will now pilot with partners in Northwest Syria to do basically the model design to your left on the slide here. Extend the better shelter unit with a wash facility on one end and a safe cooking facility and shaded area on the other end. And there you can utilize different materials on the extension portions as well. The module design also works well in sort of PWSN approaches. You can use them for grab bars, do different kinds of door openings. You can move the pipes around in the structure to allow for different kinds of openings and do modular changes and alterations to the frame afterwards. Next slide, please. So this was rapidly going through our pilot that we've spent a big portion of our time on last year together with our partners. Now we want to take it onwards. We are planning for more pilots in different regions with different climates to see how it fits into different organizations and different operations. We also want to see what happens when we move from 15 available structure as the first pilots were to 100 or 1,000 units to see what sort of implication that brings to the approach. We also aim to have a collaborative platform online where we can collect BOQs and share knowledge and basically make all the learnings that we make out of this project public domain so that we all can benefit. And with that, I think we can move over to the last slide, where I just encourage you all to please reach out to me or my good friend Tim and partner directly if you have any further question, or if your organization would be interested in piloting the modality and see how it could work in your context. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for inviting me, Tom, and UK Shelter Forum. And I will answer to the questions directly in the chat as instructed.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and very nice to see the development of this. I think it's you clearly put a lot of work into this. It's very good to see. With that, we are 2 minutes early, which is unheard of. We have a break. You have 15 minutes. Please be back at 3:45 for the next set of presentations. Thank you, everyone.
When we compare the costs for post-disaster and prevention situations, we observed that around 20 to 25% of the cost for post-disaster designs was in structural condition repairs, whereas in the case of prevention, this was less than 5%. In the prevention context, 30 to 35% of the cost was in habitability upgrades and finishing and growth, whereas in the post-disaster context, these were less than 20% altogether. And the disaster mitigation measures comprised of around 60% of the total cost for both contexts. Next, please. So when we compared the cost of housing improvement for, we compared it for only seismic, only wind, and also for both seismic and wind. The design costs for both wind and seismic was found to be about 80% higher for disaster mitigation measures than those designed only for seismic. This is when we just compare the disaster mitigation measures. Next, please. We also compared the costs for improvements that were done for, like just risk reduction, for life safety, and also we had some designs that were done for life safety, including provisions for future vertical expansions. It was found that life safety code level interventions costs about 30% more compared to a risk reduction intervention, whereas a life safety intervention, including provisions for future vertical expansions, costs 70% more compared to a risk reduction intervention. So these were the findings from comparing the cost of improving an existing housing. So thank you. Any questions?
That was excellent. Thank you very much, Liva. Any questions? Can you put them in the chat, or you could send an email? Thank you so much for keeping to time. That was very punctual of you. So now we're going to be passing on to Anna to talk about resilient housing in Colombia. Anna is also from Build Change. Anna, are you there?
I'm here.
Hi.
Hello, everyone. Hi, everyone. This is Anna Pavan. I'm a structural engineer working with Build Change. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our experience in Colombia and some engineering solutions that we have studied and designed to be applied locally to reduce vulnerability and risk related to informal houses. Next, please. I'm going to start from this picture, not because it is a particularly nice one, but it was the first picture that I took on field a few years ago. It was in Medellin. I was in the cable car. I turned around and I looked at the scale of the problem. Next, please. Talking about informal construction and houses in Colombia means to talk about unconfined brittle construction, masonry construction with very poor quality material, low resistance, very regular plan shapes, cantilevers, they're sharing walls, they're sharing roof, they're sharing sometimes into story slabs. So the problem was quite challenging at first sight. Next, please. Build Change applies and build retrofit in Colombia through the engineered solution presented in the retrofit manual. It is a manual for evaluation and design of solutions that is funded on two main codes, the local design code of Colombia and SR10 and the ICE 4113 for evaluation and retrofit of buildings in the US. The big improvement and innovation that this manual brought is that the solution presented here were thought ad hoc and specifically for this type of informal constructions. Next, please. Implementing, yes, this was approved actually for its application all around the country of Colombia. Next, please. So implementing retrofit solution in Colombia means to be part of a quite complex system that involves a different type and numbers of stakeholders. Getting a building permit here might take anywhere between 7, 12, or even more months. Building a retrofit solution might take anywhere between 6 up to 3 months, depending on the complexity and the number of stories you are working with. Next, please. Build Change. So it is quite a long way to take and to implement solutions. Build Change has direct implementation experience. Next, please. We work together with local stakeholders, mainly involving the public sector. These are public institutions that are implementing and have in place home improvement programs. Next, please. We collaborated with local university investigating on field in the laboratory, the seismic performance of this type of construction. We tuned the engineering solution that are part of the manual. We studied even better the coefficients that we use to improve the solution presented in the manual. Next, please. Still, the problem, the Build Change manual, this is another big milestone that we are working towards now. The Build Change manual is on its way to become a seismic engineering association document in Colombia. This will allow probably to the engineering approach presented in this manual to have a broader field of application, to be more recognized and possibly studied also in the local university. So we're working towards this today, and it's a very important step the Build Change is going to achieve hopefully very soon. Next, please. Still, the size of the problem, the scale of the problem is huge. So probably to offer engineered solution that aims to make all these houses safe through retrofit, engineered retrofits, is still too long, too expensive, too difficult to be implemented at this scale. So next, please. With build change, we start thinking about an alternative approach. We went back on field to the thousands of houses that we visited, and we started defining more specific problems that were recurrent for this type of construction. So at first sight, everything looks kind of messy and complicated, but if you have a better look, it is possible to define recurrent mistakes. So we start thinking, what if we don't aim to solve the whole problem at once? What if we start by solving the most recurrent and urgent problems that these houses are presenting? Next, please. So we start thinking and developing an engineering approach that we call retrofit card. That is a very easy and simple mitigation receipt, if you want, that is aiming to attack the most frequent problems that we define for different typology of houses. For typology, of course, I mean houses that are characterized by a specific type of materials, a structural system, of course, but here in general, we're talking about unreinforced masonry. And what makes a typology very specific is its configuration. So number of stories, if it has or no cantilever, open facades. So the retrofit card works when and if it is applied to very specific typology of buildings. But still, we don't have any limit in the number of retrofit cards that we can study. So we have a series of retrofit cards for different types of houses that can be applied to make them safer, not necessarily safe. So to improve the current situation of their existing status. Next, please. Build change has, so here is just a simple, I'm presenting to you the retrofit card for the single story construction, yeah? Is 7 points, 7 typical deficiencies that we notice of these constructions in Colombia: lack of ring beam, poor quality of the walls, uncompleted walls, free edge walls that were very vulnerable in case of a seismic event to collapse, for example. So as you say, 7 simple points, straightforward, to very easy to recognize and with a direct solution to be implemented. Next, please. We were able to pilot this kind of approach in joint venture with ISBMed, that is the public institution that in Medellin is implementing home improvement programs. This pilot was very, very important, not just because it could give us an idea of how much it would cost to implement this kind of approach, but also how long it might take to design and build this solution, but also what type of technical expertise would we require, for example, to implement this kind of pilots. We were not working with the most experienced engineers or architects out there. We were training junior staff, technicians, to use this approach, right, because it is so prescriptive that is not also so difficult to understand and apply. Next, please. If we compare the retrofit card approach with the full retrofit approach presented in the manual, of course, there are very serious differences in terms of cost and time required for the design and the construction of the solutions. Of course, the full retrofit is aiming to solve the whole problem, whilst the retrofit card approach affects just the most urgent vulnerabilities. But the main difference is also in terms of expected performance in case of a seismic event from the building. The full retrofit aims to a life safety performance, is a very specific performance level, whilst the retrofit card approach might vary in terms of performance depending on the type of construction it is applied to. So it is not always possible to define specifically which type of performance we will get from the retrofitted house, but we know that it makes it better. Still, next please. Still, we try to quantify.
Can you try and wrap up in the minute? Perfect, thank you.
Okay, still we try to quantify the benefit applying it to two prototype of houses. We took the average house that we noticed on field that we could survey, that is generally single story, 70 meters square, 6 by 12 rectangular shape on plan, and to the worst case scenario house that we generally survey on field with a minimum amount of walls, generally spaced at 4 meters. We apply the retrofit card to both of them, and we try to see, next please, Amalia. We try to see what it meant in terms of performance. Without details, these percentages just represent how much of the core level forces, seismic forces, the strength of the house that we intervene through the retrofit card could resist. So you see the impact, of course, change depending on the seismic hazard and the type of soil the house might be located to, but still, these are all very positive, percentages. Next, please. These percentages are less positive, but still good when they are applied to the worst case scenario house, because of course it has a configuration that is more complicated and less beneficial to the seismic response. But doing nothing will mean that probably those percentages of resistance will be much, much closer to zero. So wrapping up, just to conclude, next please. The main messages we wanted to transfer to you today is when you have to deal with such a huge problem as informal houses in Colombia, such a big scale and different scenarios, probably having different approach and an engineering framework that allows you to attack the problem from different point of view at a different scale of resources also involved is probably the way to go. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Anna. That's really interesting. Any questions for Anna in the chat? And I'm going to move on swiftly so we keep with time and invite Riccardo Conti to come and talk.
Hello.
Hi, Riccardo. Nice to see you.
Hi, Amelia. Nice to see you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation and for organizing this event. I'm Riccardo Conti. I'm the director of the charity Catalytic Action. Next, please. We are a charity that works to empower vulnerable children and their communities through participatory built interventions. We've been working mostly in Lebanon with displaced children to co-design and build playgrounds, public spaces, schools, and other educational facilities. Next, please. Today, I will speak about a research project which aimed at developing a toolkit for co-designing built interventions with children affected by displacement. The research was largely based on reflecting back on the co-design processes that our charity adopted in the past 7 years when co-designing spaces with children. So as we have learned so much from children in every project, this toolkit is really a reflection on this learning. And so it owes to over 1,500 children who, together with Catalytic Action team, co-designed and built over 30 projects. This research was done in partnership with the Bartlett Development Planning Unit at the University College London, and it was funded by a grant from the Grand Challenges Research Fund. We'll be now publishing this toolkit in the summer in partnership with UNICEF and UN Habitat. Next, please. So there are many great existing resources on co-design with people, co-design with children, but what we noticed was that there was a gap in practical guidelines, especially when it comes to co-designing built interventions with children affected by displacement, which is the main reason why we decided to develop this toolkit. So the aim was to develop a toolkit that could be as practical as possible and that could inspire and help through very clear guidelines and tools other practitioners to implement such interventions. Next, please. So because we wanted to inspire practitioners with this toolkit, we thought it was essential to engage with them to understand their point of view on this topic. So we did this through a number of online interviews and collective sessions. We engaged with national and international practitioners, NGO staff, teachers, building contractors, municipality members, and academics to cover all the expertise that are linked to these projects. Next, please. So together with the participants, we identified that co-design built interventions with children affected by displacement can empower children, improve social cohesion, for example, between displaced and host community, have a positive impact on the local economy, and ultimately deliver better infrastructure for children and their community. Next, please. And yet, despite the multiple positive impacts, it was observed that there is an undersupply of such interventions. Next, please. So we looked into these and concluded that this is mostly happening because such interventions require professionals from different fields of specialism to work together, and often organizational structures do not make these collaborations easy. Their additional value is difficult to measure, especially on the long term. They require a larger initial investment compared to the funds required to deliver only the built product. And lastly, these interventions often present multiple operational challenges, including some linked to safeguarding. Next, please. So the toolkit addresses these challenges by providing practical guidelines and tools. And the toolkit is divided in 3 parts. Part A is about designing with children. Part B talks about procurement and building. And part C is about post-building impact and sustainability. Next, please. And as I mentioned, we wanted this toolkit to be very practical, which is why we also included a number of step-by-step tools and templates that practitioners will be able to download and use to engage children in co-design activities. In addition to these, throughout the toolkit, we also present many examples of projects or simple scenarios and stories from real projects. And this was done again to keep things as practical as possible, even when explaining more theoretical concepts. Next, please. So moving to the toolkit contents in a bit more details. Part A is designing with children, and this is obviously the core section of the toolkit. It is important to mention that for us, design refers to the entire process linked to a built intervention, starting in many cases with an idea and leading to a built product. And this understanding obviously is different from other approaches that limit design just to the act of drawing a space. So when we say design with children, we also mean to engage with children in generating an idea, building a partnership, discussing funding, researching needs, and so on. Next, please. So to give you some of the key messages from part A, most importantly, children must be at the center of the co-design process. The process of designing spaces with children requires careful planning, including the preparation of tools that need to be appropriate to the context and to the participants. Next, please. Children should be engaged through playful and fun activities, and good facilitation is key for a successful participatory engagement. Next, please. Also, when working with children in vulnerable contexts, the design choices that are linked, for example, to the selection of building materials also have a major impact. And for example, if we're building a school in a refugee settlement and we are able to select building materials locally, and we can purchase these materials from small local businesses run by the parents of the children who will be then attending the school, this will have indirectly an impact on children's well-being as the project is supporting their families. Next, please. Equally, we can we can generate the same impact when we hire local labor. In this case, we had fathers and mothers of the children who will be then later on attending the school, joining the construction site. Next, please. So part B is about procurement and building, and this part is a bit more technical, but it's really important. And in fact, many participants found the topics presented here to be a major barrier to implement co-design built interventions with children within their organizations. And in fact, like if we engage children coming up with ideas and then develop design solutions, then of course these solutions need to be built. And due to the nature of this work and what I just explained about generating impact and empowerment also during the construction process, it becomes very important to also pay attention to this phase. Next, please. We also have a responsibility, for example, to ensure the health and safety of the people who build the spaces, which again, in many cases, are the parents of the children we're working with. But also, if we want to deliver innovative design solutions that are durable, built with local materials and skills, then we must develop ways to engage with procurement, not just as a boring bureaucratic step of the process, but as a very important one. Next, please. So only by approaching procurement differently and by placing children's well-being at the center of it, we would be able to implement, as I said, innovative design solutions, such as in this picture, we see a very wide slide, maybe the widest in Lebanon, which was the result of a collaboration with multiple providers. There was a very direct answer to what the kids wanted, and I quote, a slide large enough so that I can play with my friends. Next, please. Lastly, part C is about post-building impact and sustainability. And what we present in this section is that it is really important to also think about how can we maximize the impact of a built intervention. Next, please. For example, in this playground, we decided to maximize impact by setting up a basketball training for children. And the key question really in this section is how can we work with children to get the most out of these implemented spaces? And this collaboration with children that started, as I said, with coming up with an idea, that it continues to developing design solutions, building, and now is extending to post-building. The projects that really manage to get this continuous engagement with children are those that are able to generate a very strong sense of ownership towards the space. And of course, they really empower children. Next, please. The last section of the toolkit speaks about impact. And the key message here is to realize how such co-design processes have an impact that goes way beyond the physical product, but that is much more linked to the participatory process, which is what I presented here today and what really the toolkit is about. Next, please. Thank you very much. And if you're interested in downloading the toolkit, once it will be published in the summer, please follow us on social media. We'll do plenty of communication about it, so to make sure you're not going to miss it. Thank you, Amelia.
Thank you so much, Riccardo. It's really fascinating. Okay, we're going to continue the theme of designing for children and with children with Sara Candiracci from ARAP.
Yeah, thanks, Amelia. Sara Candiracci, you said it right. And it's great that my presentation comes after Riccardo's presentation, because what I'm about to present also involves the work that was done with Catalytic Action. So maybe next slide. So maybe just as an introduction, ARUP is a global firm of is a multidisciplinary firm with expertise from urban planning, design, engineering, and to social research as well. And while Bernabé Foundation is a Dutch foundation that has been working for the past 70 years in the space of improving health and well-being of young children, the caregivers. So a few years ago, we decided to start working together and to combine our complementary expertise to basically jointly address and improve the living condition and well-being of young children, the caregivers, with intention to generate benefits for the entire society. Next slide, please. The first piece of work we did together is an augmented virtual reality tool that allows the user to experience the city from the height of 95 centimeters, which is the height of a healthy 3-year-old child. And the purpose of these tools mainly is to allow the users to empathize more with what living in a city from a child perspective means. Next slide, please. While a couple of years ago, we started embarking a new adventure together and to start working on the proximity of care design guide with the intention to tackle inequalities in cities. And the guide is targeting 2 typologies of vulnerable contexts, which are informal and refugee settlements. And the reason I think is quite obvious, because there is an increasing number of people and many children who are living in this vulnerable context. Next slide. So the development of the proximity of care design guide has been driven by 3 key questions. The first one is about how ARUP's total design approach can be used to improve the living condition of vulnerable urban context. The concept of total design is a multidisciplinary approach to design which implies that greater solutions can be accomplished when technical knowledge, design, and aesthetic unite, and when all the professionals join forces right from the start. So given the complexity and multi-challenges that are common in this context, and also given the untapped opportunity that also exists in this context, we thought that a multidisciplinary system approach to planning and design is required to address the needs of young children in this context. Next slide. The second question we aim to address with the guide is about how we can help improving the well-being of the most vulnerable groups in the context, that are young children, pregnant women, and caregivers. At the same time, how can we do that while considering the needs of the broader population? So the early years of a child are extremely important for their healthy physical and mental development. But in this context, unfortunately, their needs are often not heard by decision-makers and planners. They're not duly taken into account into design and planning of the interventions that are proposed. Next slide. And the last question we aim to address through the guide is how can we help improving collaboration among professionals working in this context? How can we encourage a systems approach to urban regeneration in vulnerable context? In fact, based on our work and also research we conducted for the design guide, we saw that urban practitioners working in informal settlements, refugee settlements, they tend to focus their work on the basic and functional needs of the population. So they deliver infrastructures and services that they don't consider the needs, the development needs of children or the most vulnerable. On the other hand, existing experts and early childhood investments in work in this context, they mainly focus their work on educational services, healthcare, nutrition that are extremely important, but they could do more. We could do more together if they could consider also the role that the built environment has in shaping the experience of children. So basically this, by promoting greater collaboration, is possible to achieve greater outcomes. Next slide. So basically through the proximity of care guide, a design guide, we tried to create a common language and a common ground for collaboration for urban practitioners, early childhood development experts, humanitarian development professionals working in this context, and also for city authorities. We try to translate complex concepts into tangible and practical principles and tools to basically help these specialists to work together and to create, through their work, healthy, supportive, stimulating, and protective urban environments that can help children and communities to thrive. Next slide. The guide was compiled after extensive research and fieldwork. We identify and work in 2 refugee settlements and 2 informal settlements in Kenya, Lebanon, Jordan, and South Africa, partnering with the experienced organization and also organization who has had either experience working with children and at the same time experience working on urban design and planning. So we work with the Catalytic Action, Civic, KDI, and VPEU in these different contexts. Next slide. Also, what we aim to do was to develop a user-friendly guide. So to this end, we established a technical review committee with experts from different international organizations and also from different city authorities globally to share with them progress on the guide and also to include as much as possible their recommendations into the way we design and the guide and also develop the content. Next slide. And this is what we call the proximity of care approach that is at the core of the design guide. And it was developed with the intention to bring together 2 different worlds, the one on early childhood development and the one on urban planning and design. So it was developed basically to better understand and articulate how various urban systems relate to early childhood development needs in vulnerable urban context. The the approach considers 4 dimensions who are key for the optimal development of children, focusing so on the health, protection, stimulation, and support needs the young children and caregivers and pregnant women needs as they move through their daily life and routine in a vulnerable urban context. Next slide. No, sorry, go back to the other one. Within each dimension, the proximity of care approach focuses on the beneficiary needs at 3 primary scales of the urban interaction, that the household level, the neighborhood level, and the city level. And what we saw is that in order to improve the early childhood development conditions in this context, it's necessary to engage with all these 3 different levels simultaneously. And the application of the proximity of care approach is supported by a framework and a set of practical tools and methods that helps using the framework in this context, so to generate insight and knowledge that is needed to inform the design of interventions. Next slide. There's maybe next one, because I think there is one missing. Oh no. That's strange. No, well, there is no one slide. It's okay. Maybe you can go back to the other one. Yeah. Anyway, I will maybe share on the chat the slide that was missing, that it basically represents the structure of the proximity of care design guide and also the link to the guide, because the guide is a digital guide and we decided to make it digital for several reasons. First of all, to make it more accessible to global audiences, so to avoid the burn of printing it, shipping it, so it's easily accessible. To also make it more agile to navigate the guide, and also to update it over time, because the guides, they need to be updated more and more, so it's much easier if it's digital. And also the idea is to make the language simple, accessible to everyone, and kind of bite-sized. There are 3 key sections in the guide. That is one section about understand, one about design, and one about influence, were like the core elements of the guide. Each section is then supported by very practical tools that helps the user to undertake a comprehensive assessment in the understand section, to their guide principles and examples on how to design interventions with children at the core. And the 3rd section is about influence. So basically, how can we help? So there are recommendations on how to support, to help decision makers to influence their agenda, or how to influence urban practitioners, why it's important to adopt the child-centered approach in design and how they can do that. And again, the 3 sections are try to be very practical and provide tools and very practical examples. Next slide.
You try and wrap up.
Yeah. So next one, please. Yeah, this one. So this is just a brief example on the understand section. There is, for instance, the understanding before design principle, and there is then a clear explanation on how you actually can do that, how you can, the practical step you need to undertake to do this. And for each step, we also associated a case study to inspire people and to help them. And also there are the links to the organization who have been providing and implementing these studies, because the idea is also to use the guide to create a platform for collaboration and knowledge sharing. So thank you very much. I will send you in the chat the link to the guide so you can have access. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara. I'm going to quickly move on to Francoise Bayon from IHIP. He's going to talk about the harmonization of construction contracts. So, Francois.
Yes, hello everyone. Just checking if you can hear me. Andrea, can you... Yeah, is it fine? Okay, great. So I'm Francois Bayon. I'm the managing director of IHIP, which stands for the International Humanitarian Infrastructure Platform. And I have 10 minutes to introduce you to the value of agreeing on a form of contract, construction contract, to be used in the construction, shelter, and the WASH sectors, the humanitarian sectors. Next slide, please. So IHIP is an organization that has been created to help the humanitarian sector engage with the private sector, mainly driven by expectation from the donors to allow the NGO sector to be able to deliver larger and more complex infrastructure projects, mainly through two changes, which are going to be on the next slide actually. And we're doing this through the main deliverable we're working on are forms of contract for construction. So contract for constructions are the document that are being signed between usually the humanitarian organization, which is going to be the client, and a private sector organization, which is going to be the contractor. And sometimes, depending on the size of the project, there is a requirement for additional expertise, which we will call the engineer. And IHIP has been created because it's mainly coming from the fact that the FIDIC form of contract, so FIDIC is the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, which comes from a private sector, have been more and more used into the development world and the humanitarian world without being harmonized, meaning without being customized to match the specificities of the humanitarian context. So that's what IHIP is doing. Next slide, please. So the driving change, why is IHIP doing this today and not 20 years ago? It's mainly because the requirement for consistent and solid contract to deliver more and more complex infrastructure response have been driven by the fact that there is three main driver of change, which have recently popped up in the last decade, mainly triggered by climate change resilience. It's that there is a stronger and more, the volume of displaced population goes higher. And then the answer, because of tensions created by climate change, and then the answer to this is usually to deliver more and more urban response to maybe be able to give solutions to this displaced population. So the urbanization of the response is driving to design more and more complex infrastructure. And then if we include into this sustainable development goals, then we can say we need smart or intelligent infrastructure, which is even more complicated. And this is where we need more engineers. And then when we talk about more engineers, usually engineering, although there is already a lot within the humanitarian sector, engineers usually are into the private sector. So how do we engage with the private sector? And the engineer usually comes in this form of contract that we're working on, which is coming from FIDIC, this private sector federation. So next slide, please. Yeah, so you will understand that basically we're having to deal with new actors, the local private sectors, and the engineering and contractors, which might be local or international. And all of those have to be included in the life cycle of such projects. So because there is a new context, there's also new risks. And those new risks are mainly identified through a knowledge gap for usually within the NGO and the humanitarian actors to engage with those complex contracts. And how do we, there's a knowledge gap because the contract is usually something that nobody wants to consider because it's not very sexy and it's boring and it's quite long. Although in the shelter and the settlement infrastructure, it might be short. So we're trying to make it short, but we need to make sure that we give the right tools to de-risk the settlement construction works with the right contract. Next step. And the thing about the contract and why it's important, because it's setting up the rules on how this partnership will work together in the delivering the right project. So the private sector and the NGOs will work together with the contract, and all of this is supposed, and this is a good news for the NGOs, it's supposed to channel new funding from the donor or even the private sector side, because the contract, if it's designed and harmonized for the humanitarian sector, managing the risk meaning we will allocate the risk to the best party able to manage it. So that's the philosophy. And if they feel that there is a process that will manage the risk and it's de-risk, then there will be more the partnership will be more solid, and then attract eventually more donors, more money. And this is why the donors are asking for this, is because they're happy for the contract to secure their funding and make sure there's some tracking system and everybody using the same model. That's the other thing about harmonizing amongst the sector. It's that everybody using the same model is easier to report as well. And accounting is a key element for donors. And as well, another thing is the private sector. I put here a name about private sector associations because the voice of the private sector will also recognize itself as being as FIDIC being the right tool, and to consider the way they work, and because it's already spread out there, meaning those contracts are already well known outside of the humanitarian sector, basically in the development sector, then the private sector will feel happy to contribute and not threatened by maybe sometimes an unbalanced distribution of power and size between the NGO and the contractor. Next slide, please. So the IHIP proposal is to work to deliver an harmonized humanitarian construction contract, and because it has a better risk allocation, it's a de-risking tool. This is the current work is being done with the cluster at the cluster level, and we've done this with the Global WASH cluster members, and it's in progress now with the Global Shelter cluster. So there's been a survey that has been circulating. It's almost, well, it's closed now. Some of you might have seen this survey if you're familiar with contracts and if you're interested with contracts, but this survey is collecting best practices and feedback from the sector. And we've moved outside of the shelter sector to make it bigger and consider settlement construction works to have a bigger vision. And we're working now on consolidating the feedback of the sector to attach particular conditions to the FIDIC short form of contract, which you might be familiar with. Maybe not, it's a very technical document. It's contract, but it's the most popular document around there in the contract sphere. And next slide, please. So for the WASH sector, there's been this survey circulated to the WASH cluster members. And then we had a WASH contract committee, meaning individuals that were part of those NGOs or humanitarian organization or even donors were happy to review and consolidate with the IHIP secretariat the document. And then we've drafted particular conditions of contract that were released in November 2020. And then next slide, please. So that's almost 6 months ago, and we're working now. So the results, just to have a feeling of what it's about, you can get your copy. It's free from the IHIP website, ihip.earth, and it's basically attaching 18 improvements in the particular conditions, which are either employer-friendly, contractor-friendly, or humanitarian-specific. And there's actually only one WASH specific item in there, which is talking about how to deal with unforeseen underground physical conditions. So that's specific to WASH, maybe shelter as well. But so you have better contract management, 7 improvements, improved risk allocation, 5 improvements, and improved procurement, 5 improvements in there. So in total,
have 1 minute, Francois.
Okay, so you can move to the next slide. We're doing the same thing for the settlement and shelter sector, and we've finalized the survey in mid-March, and we're consolidating the result of the survey now from the sector. And next slide. The goal of this small introduction is if there's anyone around the audience today that is interested and happy to contribute, we will have a friendly review of the result of our work for the shelter and settlement construction work, and we will be happy if you're interested to contribute, to subscribe to the list and send me an email. So I'm François Bayon, I'm the managing director of IHIP, and there's my email, fbayon@ihip.earth, and be happy to get your comments. That's it. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you, Francois. Okay, we're going to move into the next 3 and final presentations today, and the themes for the next 3 are focused around camps, health, safety, fire risk, and with the theme of Cox's Bazar as well. So I'll pass over to Sneha Krishnan to start us off. Sneha, are you ready? Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be presenting after almost 6 years. Thanks everyone for staying around. I know it's been a long day. I just want to give a summary snapshot of some primary research we did in Cox's Bazar. Next slide, please. But I have to acknowledge funding from a Medical Research Council, and the work was undertaken with LSHTM and partners in University of Dhaka and BRAC. Just so that you all remember, because it's been a long day, 3 things that I want you to take from today's presentation is that we used a method called photo elicitation, which actually provided a very unique perspective into people's lived experiences. The second argument that I'm trying to make is that shelter sector can learn from the evidence that has been generated in other sectors. And lastly, I want to argue that although we do argue for intersectoral coordination approaches, but in practice, it's often very ad hoc. And even within the government, it's very sporadic. And
yeah,
perhaps
that's right.
focusing on inclusion and localization objectives might be a better objective. Next slide, please. So the question that stemmed this research was based on my PhD as well, where I found that perhaps using a cross-sectoral resilience approach can add value to health, borrowing from WASH and shelter and settlements perspective, but also from gender, nutrition, and child protection lenses. So we undertook evidence synthesis, which has been published in the Journal of Migration and Health last year. And we developed a framework based on the theory of change approach, which I'll briefly talk about later. And the focus of this presentation is largely on the photo elicitation interviews, where camp members were actually encouraged to take pictures of their surroundings as to what they meant posed as risk and could improve so that they become resilient in the future. Next slide, please. What we learned from using this approach was actually we got insights into how people used their spaces around them. Inclusion of particular groups such as women and children was often important, and we found examples where women talked about women-friendly spaces as allowing them to talk about their own experiences, and could often lead to understand about gender-based violence and sexual and reproductive health, but often through a capable and nuanced discussion with these groups. When we asked these camp residents to take pictures about health and resilience, we found that majority of participants actually photographed their immediate surroundings. There were pictures about drainage, water and sanitation facilities, and they often perceived risks around health and safety because of how garbage and waste collected around them, and how during rains or fires, these often posed a health hazard to them. Next slide, please. Some images that I want to show and their interpretation of those are in the upcoming slides. This is an image that one of the women responded had taken, where she talks about how this space near her house poses a risk in terms of bad odor, in terms of flies, in terms of how they do not feel like eating living next to this space, but it is also something that they have learned to live with. And no matter how much they complain, there is this sense of not being heard by the authorities. Next slide, please. Amelia, next slide. Similarly, some more images about how the rains impact this region, especially because they are capturing these photographs because they talk about living in these spaces most of the time, and cooking and accessing health centers and other important spaces within the camp in such a landscape. Next slide. Specifically, when we focus on their house and how they access wash facilities, they often complained about how these spaces are built once and then they never get to customize it as per their needs if there are elderly in the houses or if there are children in the houses. And there is often very limited support for operation and maintenance. These are the codes that they have talked about. The washroom and the toilet facilities that were given to them. Next slide, please. These are images of people's, apologies about that, face being included in the photograph, but they have they mention about using plastic sheets for their houses, but which have not withstood with the heat and the rains, and challenges with the flooring, which poses risk to them for cooking within these spaces. And also whenever there are rains, access becomes very difficult for them to move around or to meet their friends or to go to a health center. Next slide, please. So there are a range of photographs that we analyzed from almost 25 respondents. What we could unpack from these images and how they discussed about it was there are some lessons that the shelter sector could learn from how people understood health systems resilience and vice versa. But for purposes of this audience, I wanted to focus on how site planning tends to focus mostly on layout for their houses, despite overcrowding contexts, provision of drainage and a proper wash, especially when they are living in these houses which are considered to be temporary housing. These continue to pose health and safety risks as perceived by the residents in the camps. Whereas on the other hand, what the shelter sector could do is actually link with the idea of how accessible these settlements are from the health outpost. And build a consensus and advocate for more health infrastructure within these camp communities. There has been evidence where we have learned about women and child-friendly spaces which have been provided by some of the agencies, but these are often very top-down approach and very centered, and can provide a useful opportunity for women to come together, but they have to reflect these social networks and cultural relationships between these groups. Lastly, like I said earlier, linkages between these clusters are very sporadic and often not strong, which is the reason why perhaps when we look at our cluster approach, in which we try to achieve different things from different sectors, we tend to be very disparate in our efforts. Next slide, please. I'm afraid I would not have enough time to go into this in quite detail, but I'm happy to take questions on the chat. Using a theory of change and having reviewed the evidence, we actually understood some ways in which different tools and intervention and activities could also benefit the health sector. For example, we understand training and monitoring are proving to be quite interesting in inputs while we are preparing for an intervention, but within the intervention itself, we came across many other examples which used context-specific barriers and enablers for improving practices. These may not be specific for housing and shelter as the evidence presents, but we see that in food and in nutrition and in other contexts where these have been applied, they are found to be much more instrumental in making a change happen. And like I said, creation of spaces for women, children, and youth have shown quite a large impact on improving their psychosocial health. Let me just focus on one more tools which have been used in the education sector, where there is an emphasis on non-formal education methods using arts, music, play, sports, and storytelling, which have been found to be very useful for not just education, but also for health and hygiene promotion, nutrition education, and can also be useful for improving housing practices within these communities. This then borrows from the participatory and inclusive discussions that we've seen in other presentations today.
Less than a minute if you want to go to the most important bit.
Please. So to summarize, we all are aware of the context that within Bangladesh, there is a lot of changes that is happening with the camp residents. And we have looked at how open defecation, improper drainage, and reluctance in reaching out to authorities and engaging with the service providers has not only affected the health sector, but has also seems to be a challenge within the other sectors as well. And to summarize on photo elicitation, I'm happy to take any questions on that on the chat. Last slide, please. Yeah, those are my conclusions, which is with, I began with those, so I don't want to repeat myself.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we can move swiftly on to Vita Sanderson from ARIP. Hello, Vita. I'll let you take it away.
Hi there. Thanks, Amelia. So thank you very much for having us, and really interesting to hear all the talks from earlier this afternoon. So we're going to speak today about fire safety in health centres with a focus on Cox's Bazar. And so this talk is really a brief summary based on some work that we started last year, supporting various partners such as IOM and the WHO in the implementation of their rapidly deployed COVID treatment facilities in the camps. And fire safety was really identified as a key area, driven in particular with the provision of oxygen therapies in these facilities. And then, of course, with the devastating fire, which then happened on the 22nd of March, the importance of fire safety in improving the resilience of the provision of essential services like healthcare has really come to the fore. So without further ado, I'll hand over to my colleagues Ken and Laura to talk through some of the key points, and then we'll summarize at the end with a few links to resources for more information. Ken?
Thanks very much, Vita. And hi, everybody. And really, really interesting talks today, and really, really glad and appreciative to be here. I just thought before going into maybe detail on some of our work in the healthcare facilities, I take the opportunity to touch on some of the maybe bigger and higher challenges that we see in informal settlements in fire safety. And fire safety and I suppose fire safety provisions in informal settlements and camps and shelters are incredibly complex. And it is an area that it's very fair to say is quite a under-researched area, and research in the area is quite young. But what we do know is there is some really, I suppose, compounding constraints that have major impact on the spread of fire within informal settlements and across informal settlements. And one of those is the density of the settlement itself. So we often see, due to the various other constraints that are in place in camps and informal settlements, we have a real restriction and a lot of pressure on space. And we often don't have what we call natural breaks or possible strategic breaks between certain camps and shelters. And this is a real obvious mechanism for fire spread across a campsite. And we've seen evidence of that, obviously, sadly, this year in March in Cox's Bazar. Another key element of that that's quite closely related would be the material choice and the materials that we have in a camp or informal settlement. So again, we see that when we've got combustible materials, which is often quite very, very difficult to design out, the material selection, the choice of material, and I suppose the impact of that material to both contribute to ignition and flame spread within the camp setting is quite significant. So these are things that are can be quite difficult to probably design out or to approach, but where there is an opportunity to select materials which may reduce that risk or provide strategic breaks that might reduce that type of spread, it's really important to take that opportunity to build it back better, if you like. There are other key issues around, I suppose, ignition risk and spread, which are associated with largely to do with energy poverty and the fact that in a lot of cases we see a need to use open flame sources for both cooking and heating. And that really results in substantially increased risks on ignition. So we can see the simplest action of maybe a child playing with a candle or a stove, kind of devastating consequences when it comes to a simple spill of kerosene that can result in an actual dwelling fire, or which again from there can spread into a very, very large developed fire across various areas of the camp. So when we looked at those risks alone, and we've been researching those as part of the development for our framework for fire safety and informal settlements and our low resource care box, we were very, very mindful of these when we started thinking about the risks associated with healthcare facilities, when we started looking at trying to implement risk reduction measures for the healthcare facilities in Cox's Bazar this year. So when we think again about risk and we look at the risk in the context of healthcare, we've got increased risks again associated with the sleeping and immobile nature of the occupancy. So we've got occupants in the healthcare setting who may be completely reliant on others to move within the actual compound or outside of the compound. They may be reliant on oxygen feeds. So we have to think about the movement of patients in different settings like ICU and HDU, and how to move and disconnect oxygen and provide that support. Then we also need to think about other complex features that will exist within a compound, such as the various storage of chemicals and the storage and connectivity of oxygen, because with oxygen itself is what we call, oxygen itself in terms of an oxygen-rich environment can result in accelerated growth of fire at the early stages. So it's very, very important that we think about those connections and we think about how to disconnect oxygen and store oxygen in an appropriate way. And sadly, unfortunately, we see from recent events, as Vita touched on in March gone by, when fires do happen in camps, they can be substantial, they can be vast. And in this case, unfortunately, over 10,000 shelters were lost and 7 healthcare facilities were lost. So it's a real close reminder of the type of risks we're dealing with when we think about the actual fire safety within the setting of a compound, but also the external threats towards the actual compound itself. Next slide, please, Vita. So when we started looking at trying to implement risk reduction measures at compound level, we looked at that at the building scale. So we used our framework for fire safety and informal settlements, using the framework, thinking about risk and risk reduction measures at mitigation, preparedness, response and recovery stages. We thought about this in the context of what we call the ALARP process. And the ALARP process is really thinking about risk reduction measures to a level which is as low as reasonably practical. And this is very important when working in the camp and shelter setting and environment, because we know we're not going to be afforded the level of, or the standards, if you like, that you'd expect to see in other areas of the built environment. And we have to be incredibly respectful of the complexities that can vary significantly with regard to global context. And we also have to be, I suppose, very respectful of the constraints within the wider setting of the camp. And that is to do again with what I touched on earlier in terms of materials and proximity and density. And these are constraints that we often, unfortunately, don't have the influence to change. So it's very important that we can understand and implement what we can change. So using the ALARP process allowed us to, I suppose, think through that lens. And again, going back to healthcare, thinking about, the risks associated with the immobile occupancy, thinking about, how we think about evacuation of that occupancy, how we think about the warning systems and the other features that may help reduce the immediate threat, if you like, within the healthcare compound, while we also think about the various wayfinding avenues and the likes from the compound as and when they may be required. So just to maybe give an overview of the wider risks and how we thought about healthcare fire safety in that context. So from there, I'll hand over to Laura, who's going to go into that in a little bit more detail.
We just have 2 minutes, so sorry to rush you.
Thanks, Amelia. Next slide. So I won't go into all the details, but on this slide, we've just highlighted a few of the factors that we're considering when we're looking at fire risk reduction. And these cover, all of the different stages of our cycle. I'll just quickly rip around. We've got mitigation and prevention. Here we're thinking about things like materials or site arrangement, maintenance of equipment, storage of combustibles. Around the cycle, we go into preparation. So that's about escape routes, both from the building and the site, making sure you've got options for your escape routes. Thinking about equipment like exit signage or detection or alarm if possible. And then firefighting preparation, so staff training in a healthcare context or training of occupants, coordination with fire services or facilities for the fire brigade to access. The response phase, once the actual fire has occurred, the investigation period, making sure the fire is confirmed quickly, intervention, some early firefighting if possible, and evacuation, especially important in healthcare where that would need to be a managed evacuation. And then it comes around to recovery and continuity, fire and smoke clearance kind of mopping up, contingency plans for occupants, where they're going to go, how are they going to be looked after, and how can we build back better? So then you would go around the cycle again. How can you make changes to improve things? Next slide, please. This slide really is just trying to illustrate that aspects of fire safety can be addressed all throughout the life cycle of a project, right from site selection all the way down to operations and maintenance. So everybody has a role to play in fire risk reduction. It also is illustrating the concept.
Right. We're at time, so you might just want to say that your final.
Sure, fine. No, that's fine. Okay, we might just flick forward 2 slides then, I think, and finish on some links to further information.
I can pop these in the chat as well. So yeah, if you just want to summarize with the one before this.
Yeah. Oh, okay, sure. Flick back 1 slide. So this is just an illustration here that there's lots of actors who need to be involved and lots of physical and management aspects that can go into improving fire safety and reducing the risk.
Super. Thank you so much. Good picture to end on. Okay, so passing swiftly on. Danielle, are you there? Yes.
Hello, thank you, Amelia. And hi, everyone. Thank you again for the invitation to speak and for organizing the event. I think I have the difficult job of having the last session, and I know you're probably all need to go for your weekend, so I appreciate you sticking around. It is really nice to be able to follow up from the ARIP team, who's covered a lot of the issues and challenges, as well as opportunities around fire safety. I worked with this team at ARIP for many years, so it's also just nice personally. But anyways, my name is Danielle Antonellis. I am a fire safety engineer and the founder and executive director of Kindling, which is a new nonprofit organization dedicated to improving fire safety in both humanitarian and development sectors. This presentation is speaking to the importance of fire safety research and coordination. There is definitely growing recognition of the criticality of fire risk management in humanitarian contexts, and a growing body of research into different facets from a range of different disciplines and expertises. But this body really exists in parallel initiatives and across disparate groups, and there remain gaps in scope for duplication of effort, which we're trying to address as a group. So on every slide of this presentation, you will see a little link. You can see it here with a survey and a QR code as well. We'd really appreciate it if you were able to fill this out. It shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. Thank you. And next slide, please. So I did want to provide a quick introduction since there isn't time for everyone on the slide that you can see here to speak, but I am presenting kind of with and on behalf of this small cohort of people that I've had the pleasure to work with over the past months. First, we have Phil Deloy, a humanitarian advisor to the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK, formerly DFID. We have Elizabeth Palmer from Save the Children, and she's the global construction lead, and also Jim Kennedy, who's an independent consultant and on the board of directors of Kindling. We are working with others as well to try to unify and develop a cooperative initiative to address fire risk. And as you can see here, our goal is to develop best practice to reduce deaths, injuries, and losses from fire in humanitarian contexts through interagency and intercluster coordination. To do this, we aim to bring together humanitarians and fire safety specialists. And I do want to take this quick opportunity to acknowledge some of the leading fire safety organizations that you may or may not know about that have been pioneering fire research and practices in camps and informal settlements, such as Operation Florian/Fire Aid, University of Edinburgh, Stellenbosch University, of course you just saw Arup, as well as individual researchers at different universities such as John Twig, Laura Hurst, Greg Bancroft, and others. And these groups are really working hard to study the types of fires that affect settlements and to contextualize fire safety practices and develop strategies that are appropriate and achievable in complex settlement environments with limited resources and lots of constraints. I also, in addition to the AIRT team, I saw that David Rush has been on the call the last 2 days, so definitely reach out to him, for example, to learn more about the work they're doing at Edinburgh. Next slide, please. So as we've already heard, catastrophic fires are common in informal settlements and camps. There are multiple incidents happening daily around the world, and these fires are taking lives, property, and livelihoods. They are undermining humanitarian assistance as well as development, and exacerbate poverty, marginalization, and other vulnerabilities. And they have significant environmental impacts as well, both directly from the fire, but also indirectly relating to the need for reconstruction, for example. And we've already heard about this fire, I'm sure you've heard about it anyways, but the March 22nd fire in the Rohingya refugee camps in Cox's Bazar demonstrated just how destructive fire can be in humanitarian settlements. At least 11 deaths have been reported and hundreds of people were reported missing. And according to a April 6 report from the Intersector Coordination Group, this fire affected 48,300 individuals and left over 10,000 households without shelter. This fire also destroyed over 1,600 facilities, including healthcare facilities like the team before was just talking about, as well as distribution points, learning centers, and more. I personally find it really difficult to grapple with the scale of this particular fire and many of the others, as well as its impacts, not just to the physical environment, but also thinking about the psychosocial impacts on affected populations, many of whom have had or may have had traumas associated with fire being used as a weapon back in Myanmar. And there are also other social, economic, and political dimensions of fire which have cascading consequences for affected populations and humanitarian agencies, as well as governments. So while this fire and many others do paint a bleak picture, next slide, please. Fire safety can be improved. And I really want to emphasize that. Fire safety can be improved. This is not impossible that we can do something about this. This slide shows just a few examples of some initiatives focused on improving fire safety. On the left, you can see some photographs from an initiative in Lebanon that started in 2016 when Save the Children invited Operation Florian to carry out a fire risk assessment of several refugee camps and substandard housing. Building on the recommendations from the assessment, an interagency coordination group was developed with key humanitarian agencies and the government to deliver fire risk reduction programming. And this ranged from upgrading shelters through to fire safety education and much more, both hard and soft type of fire safety interventions. On the top right, when the slide can come back, you'll be able to see some photographs from a development project as an example. This was done by BRAC in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Actually, the lead of the project is a kindling director, Raysat Faisal. And this was a community fire safety project developed with and for a small community in Korail informal settlements, using kind of human-centered design approaches. And this included physical interventions as well as fire safety training and relationship building with the residents of the fire brigade, which is a really important point as well. There are several others I really just don't have time to share today, but the important point I want to make here is, again, fire safety can be improved, but there is no silver bullet to address this problem, unfortunately. Fire is not just a technical issue, it is a social, political, and economic problem too, and it must be understood holistically. Multi-pronged approaches are critical to improve fire safety. Next slide, please. So as a cross-cutting issue, fire safety needs coordination between agencies, clusters, and often with the local governments. There are specific aspects of fire safety which are relevant for each cluster, as shown here. I don't have time to go through them today, but you can kind of pick some of them out as you read. And while protective actions can be taken independently by each cluster, a well-coordinated system of fire safety should be the goal. So we've begun to engage with some of the other clusters around fire safety, including CCCM and WASH, but we're always looking for more opportunities to engage, and would appreciate any connections or ideas that you might have. And within shelter and settlements, you can see some of the kind of most obvious, perhaps, options or opportunities to improve fire safety around settlement planning, shelter construction design, material choices and methods of construction, NFIs, etc. We really could spend a lot of time, I think, on this slide, but in the interest of time, can we please move on to the last slide next, which is a bit of an announcement. Thank you. So we're very pleased to share that a new fire safety project is kicking off. This project is being funded by the Global Shelter Cluster USAID BHA grant with co-funding from FCDO. So thank you very much for the support. Kindling is leading the project with the Global Shelter Cluster Construction Standards Working Group. And our research team currently includes myself, Phil Deloy, Liz Palmer, Jim Kennedy, and some university students, but we're very eager for others to join the effort. So you could be a contributor, contributing through the survey, which again, you see the link on the top right, but we'll also be doing interviews and focus groups throughout the project cycle. And if you wanted to join in as part of the research team, we'd very much welcome that as well. In the survey, you'll be able to express your interests and how you might want to get involved. And really, this is about addressing the fact that fire risk reduction efforts to date have really been context specific, and there's been good practices developed in different parts of the world, but they haven't necessarily been connected. So this project aims to establish a foundation for systemic change across shelter and settlements and the humanitarian sector more widely. We aim to engage with practitioners and researchers to better understand past and current fire safety efforts, knowledges and practices, and to learn from those context-specific fire safety programming. We'll be studying how fire risk emerges and also how it could be avoided through various decision-making processes. We'll be looking at fire incident investigations, reporting and data sharing, looking at how that could be improved across, within context, but also across them, among several other threads around fire safety. So it should be a really exciting project. Our deliverables will be a report on the current state of fire safety and shelter, humanitarian shelter and settlements, and some field guidance or tool to be developed, really, based on what is needed and what we learned through the project. But again, most importantly, this project is really intended to bring people and knowledge together and to identify opportunities to drive systemic fire risk reduction into humanitarian shelter and settlements and other sectors. So we'd really like to invite you. I know I keep repeating myself, but please fill out the survey, and that's all I have for today. So I think next slide is our contact details. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you. A bit of a positive close then, we're working towards making a change, so that's fantastic. And you've had the pleasure of bringing the 27th UK Shelter Forum to an end. We do usually, we are usually together, and we can spend some time to debrief before usually going to the pub. And before we go to our virtual pubs, which you can see the links are on the screen, Tom and I are just going to take just the last couple of minutes just to reflect on the last 2 days, and then we can all go and socialise. So I just wanted to, say thank you very much for all the attendees of the Women in Shelter session that took place yesterday. It was especially important to the panelists that everybody was so supportive, and we've had some really, really good feedback and positive messaging from female and male colleagues about that session. I think it was really, really inspiring, and I'm really pleased that we can now talk more about women's experiences of working in the sector, and we can normalise these conversations. And that is really, really the first step to improving gender equity in the sector. So just a big thanks on that. And it was quite an overwhelming session, and it took a lot out of the people involved, and we've there's been a lot of work behind the scenes. So just to repeat that thanks, and then I'll pass on to Tom to share reflections from the rest of the sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we are slightly over time, but thank you for giving us just a few more minutes. It's been such a pleasure organising this event and having everyone join in, and it's been so gratifying and great having all these fantastic presentations. As Amelia said, I think everyone was blown away by the power of the first session, but there was also a lot more in this forum, and just a few themes that emerged. I thought there was a lot of engineering content, which obviously I like. I'm an engineer, but a lot from Build Change, but also from other organisations looking at retrofitting, looking at what works and what doesn't work in technical interventions. And it's really nice to see, I think, many years of work coming together in some consensus around the importance of iterative upgrades. Really nice to see the retrofit the cards approach from Build Change, and that looking at making things safer and not necessarily looking at absolutist approaches, and really pragmatic approaches to how we improve things, which is I think a real move in the sector over many years. And also seeing previously neglected important issues becoming more mainstream, like fire we've just talked about, which has been sorely neglected over many years, and environment, the importance of environment, and it's really good, as well as having our presentations at the end of yesterday, to see the Global Shelter Cluster putting this as a central theme, and a clear direction from interaction and from others on where research needs to go, and some really challenging research topics there that really highlight our weaknesses on inclusion and making sure that we meet the needs of all the different people we work with. So some really interesting stuff there, and some real challenges for the sector. There was obviously a lot more in the event, and we will put the video of the full 2 days on the Shelter Forum website and on the YouTube channel, so you can watch it all later. And we'll also put the chat information, because there's quite a lot of wealth of richness in the chat, and hopefully with that you will all, I hope everyone got as much out of it as I did. As I said at the beginning of the two days, I think everyone has had a tough year. Some people are still having very difficult times, and it's really good to be able to come together and share knowledge, and know that there are so many people working towards the same aims. And with that, we can now go and relax. And if you are available and you do have some more time, please do join any one of the 3 venues on the screen. I will share a file in the chat as well right now, which has the links in it, so you can download that, so you can have them on your own computer as well. Please join any one of these and switch between them as you will, and bring your own drinks, bring your own snacks, and stay as long as you like. And with that, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you in particular to all the speakers. And we will go on to the venues, and if anyone wants to see me, I'll be in the Lord Gym. So thank you, everyone. Bye bye.